Cognitive overload. Cognitive overload is a psychological state created when the mind is flooded with more information, choices, or stimuli than it can comfortably process. When this happens, the brain stops analyzing deeply and begins searching for relief. It wants simplicity, direction, and escape from the pressure. In this state, critical thinking weakens, resistance softens, and influence becomes easier. The human brain is not designed to hold endless variables at once. When overwhelmed, it prioritizes speed over accuracy and comfort over logic. This is why people under mental strain are more likely to agree, comply, or defer decisions to someone else. Overload quietly shifts control away from the individual and toward whoever appears calm, confident, or decisive. Emotionally, cognitive overload creates tension, fatigue, and a subtle sense of urgency. The mind feels crowded, as if thoughts are stacking on top of each other with no room to breathe. In that discomfort, people crave clarity. They become drawn to simple statements, firm suggestions, and definitive answers, even if those answers would normally be questioned. This effect is amplified when information is delivered rapidly or layered with emotional cues. The brain struggles not only with content, but with the emotional weight attached to it. As pressure builds, people stop evaluating intent and start reacting. Decisions are made to reduce mental strain rather than to reach the best outcome. Cognitive overload is often used in environments where speed matters more than reflection. Under its influence, hesitation feels painful, and certainty feels soothing. The mind, desperate to regain balance, accepts guidance simply to quiet the noise, mistaking relief for correctness and calm for truth. Emotional mirroring. Emotional mirroring is the act of subtly reflecting another person's emotional state back to them, creating a powerful sense of being seen, felt, and understood. At a deep psychological level, humans crave emotional validation more than logic or solutions. When someone mirrors how we feel, our nervous system relaxes, our guard lowers, and trust begins to form without conscious effort. This technique works because emotions are contagious. The brain is constantly scanning its environment for emotional cues to determine safety and connection. When another person aligns emotionally with us, it signals familiarity and acceptance, anger met with calm empathy, excitement matched with enthusiasm, or sadness reflected with quiet understanding makes the emotional experience feel shared rather than isolated. Emotionally, this creates a subtle bond. People begin to associate relief, comfort, or intensity with the presence of the person mirroring them. They feel less alone in their internal state, which can be deeply disarming. Once that connection forms, influence becomes easier because resistance requires emotional distance, and mirroring collapses that distance. The power of emotional mirroring lies in its invisibility. It doesn't demand agreement or force persuasion. Instead, it gently synchronizes emotional rhythms until the other person feels aligned with you. At that point, they listen more closely, trust more easily, and respond more openly. When used intentionally, emotional mirroring can guide conversations, de-escalate conflict, or deepen attachment. When used manipulatively, it can create a false sense of intimacy, drawing people in by echoing their inner world. The emotion feels mutual, even if the intent is not, and that illusion can be stronger than logic itself. Subtle framing. Subtle framing is the psychological act of shaping how information is perceived before the mind has a chance to question it. Instead of changing the facts, it quietly changes the lens through which those facts are seen. Human perception is highly sensitive to context, and the way something is introduced often determines how it is judged, felt, and remembered. The brain relies on mental shortcuts to interpret reality quickly. When information is framed in a certain emotional tone, the mind accepts that tone as guidance. A situation described as an opportunity feels energizing, while the same situation framed as a risk feels threatening, even if nothing concrete has changed. Emotion is set first, logic follows later. This technique works because people rarely analyze raw information in isolation. They absorb meaning, intention, and implication simultaneously. Subtle framing influences those layers beneath conscious awareness, directing attention towards certain details while quietly minimizing others. What is emphasized feels important. What is softened feels irrelevant. Emotionally, framing creates expectation. It primes the listener to feel a certain way before they fully understand why. Once that emotional expectation is established, the brain works to confirm it rather than challenge it. Doubt feels like friction, and agreement feels smooth and natural. Over time, subtle framing shapes beliefs, not through force, but through repetition and tone. It influences decisions by making one interpretation feel obvious and another feel unreasonable. The most powerful frames are calm, confident, and familiar, because the mind trusts what feels stable. In that quiet stability, perception shifts without resistance, and influence takes root before awareness ever arrives. Anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is a psychological effect where the mind latches onto the first piece of information it receives and uses it as a reference point for everything that follows. Once that initial anchor is set, all future judgments are unconsciously pulled toward it, even when new information suggests a different conclusion. The brain treats the first impression as a foundation, and shifting away from it requires effort most people never realize they are avoiding. This happens because the mind seeks efficiency. Evaluating every new detail from scratch is mentally expensive, so the brain relies on the anchor to conserve energy. Emotionally, the anchor creates a sense of familiarity and stability. It feels safe to measure new information against something already accepted, even if that starting point is flawed. Anchors are especially powerful when they are delivered with confidence or emotional weight. A strong opening statement can quietly dominate the entire decision-making process. Once planted, the anchor shapes expectations, narrows perspective, and subtly limits the range of acceptable outcomes. Emotion plays a critical role in reinforcing anchors. If the initial information triggers surprise, fear, or excitement, it embeds itself deeper into memory. The emotional charge makes the anchor feel important, and importance makes it sticky. From there, the mind begins adjusting instead of questioning. As conversations unfold, people believe they are thinking freely, unaware that their thoughts are orbiting the original reference point. Anchoring bias doesn't force agreement, it bends perception. By the time alternatives appear, they are judged not on their own merit, but on how close or far they feel from the anchor that quietly claimed control at the very beginning. Authority suggestion. Authority suggestion is a psychological influence that occurs when ideas are accepted not because they are proven, but because they come from a perceived source of power, expertise, or confidence. The human brain is deeply conditioned to associate authority with safety and correctness. From childhood, we learn that listening to authority figures reduces risk and uncertainty, and that conditioning never fully disappears. When an authority figure speaks, the mind relaxes its defenses. Doubt feels unnecessary, even uncomfortable. Emotionally, authority provides relief from responsibility. Accepting guidance from someone who appears knowledgeable feels easier than navigating uncertainty alone. That emotional comfort makes suggestions feel trustworthy before they are even examined. This effect is strengthened by tone, posture, and certainty. Authority does not always require titles or credentials. It often emerges through calm confidence and decisive language. When suggestions are delivered without hesitation, the brain interprets them as already vetted, already safe. Emotionally, authority suggestion creates a subtle shift in power. The listener moves from active evaluation to passive acceptance. Questioning feels disruptive, while agreement feels cooperative. Over time, repeated exposure to authority-driven suggestions conditions the mind to comply automatically. This technique is frequently used in leadership, education, and persuasion, but it also carries a darker edge. When authority is assumed rather than earned, it can override personal judgment. People may act against their own instincts simply because resistance feels like disobedience. In those moments, the authority doesn't just guide behavior, it reshapes belief, quietly replacing independent thought with borrowed certainty. Silent compliance. Silent compliance is the psychological phenomenon where people agree internally without ever verbally consenting. It happens in the quiet moments where no objection is raised, no resistance is voiced, and no boundary is clearly stated. The absence of refusal is unconsciously interpreted as acceptance, both by the influencer and by the person being influenced. This tactic works because humans are deeply uncomfortable with confrontation and social friction. Silence often feels safer than disagreement. When a situation subtly pressures someone to respond quickly or avoid awkwardness, the mind chooses inaction, believing it can always correct things later. That correction rarely comes. Emotionally, silent compliance is driven by hesitation, uncertainty, and the fear of disrupting harmony. The brain weighs the emotional cost of speaking up against the perceived risk of going along, and in moments of ambiguity, comfort wins. The body remains still, the voice stays quiet, and the decision is made without conscious acknowledgement. Once silence has occurred, the mind works to justify it. People reinterpret their inaction as agreement to reduce internal conflict. This creates a psychological commitment that grows stronger over time. What began as passive avoidance becomes an internal belief that the outcome was chosen willingly. Silent compliance thrives in situations where authority, urgency, or social pressure is present. The lack of explicit consent makes the influence feel invisible, yet deeply effective. By the time awareness returns, the decision has already settled, and undoing it feels more difficult than allowing it to continue. The silence echoes long after the moment has passed, shaping behavior without ever announcing itself. Choice limitation. Choice limitation is a psychological technique that reduces perceived freedom by narrowing available options while preserving the illusion of control. Instead of forcing a decision, it gently guides the mind toward a small, curated set of outcomes. The person still feels autonomous, yet the range of possible actions has already been quietly decided for them. The human brain becomes stressed when faced with too many choices. Excess options create doubt, fatigue, and fear of making the wrong decision. Choice limitation offers relief. By shrinking the decision space, it calms the mind and makes action feel easier, safer, and more manageable. What feels like restriction is experienced as clarity. Emotionally, this technique removes the anxiety of uncertainty. When only a few paths are presented, the brain stops searching for alternatives and starts evaluating within the given frame. Attention narrows. Resistance softens. The question shifts from, "What should I do?" to, "Which of these feels better?" That shift alone changes behavior. Choice limitation is especially effective when the options are emotionally weighted. One option may feel safer, another more exciting, another more responsible. The person isn't deciding whether to engage at all, only how. The most powerful limitation happens when the preferred outcome is framed as the most comfortable or socially acceptable choice. Because the individual believes they chose freely, the decision feels self-owned. That ownership strengthens commitment and reduces regret. The mind defends its own choices more fiercely than those imposed from the outside. In this way, choice limitation doesn't remove freedom outright. It reshapes it, guiding behavior while letting the person believe they were always in control. Implicit pressure. Implicit pressure is a silent force that influences behavior without ever being spoken aloud. It operates in the space between words, expectations, and social awareness, making people feel compelled to act without understanding exactly why. There is no direct demand, no clear threat, yet the weight of expectation becomes heavy enough to shape decisions. Humans are deeply sensitive to social signals. We instinctively monitor tone, pauses, and unspoken cues to gauge what is expected of us. Implicit pressure forms when those cues suggest that a certain response is preferred, normal, or quietly required. The fear is not punishment, but discomfort, disapproval, or being seen as different. Emotionally, this creates tension. The mind senses that choosing otherwise would create friction, even if no one explicitly says so. That friction feels risky. People begin to comply not because they agree, but because resistance feels socially unsafe. The pressure is internalized, making the choice feel self-directed when it is not. Implicit pressure is powerful because it preserves the illusion of freedom. The individual believes they are acting on their own judgment, unaware that the emotional environment has been carefully shaped. Silence becomes persuasive. Expectations become instructions. This tactic is often used in group settings, authority dynamics, and close relationships where harmony is valued. Over time, repeated exposure to implicit pressure trains people to anticipate expectations before they are expressed. They begin to self-correct, self-limit, and self-comply, guided by an invisible force that never raises its voice but still quietly controls the outcome. Pattern interruption. Pattern interruption is a psychological technique that works by breaking the mental autopilot the brain relies on to move through familiar situations. Human behavior is largely driven by routines, expectations, and predictable sequences. When those patterns are suddenly disrupted, the mind momentarily freezes, creating a brief window where awareness spikes and defenses drop. The brain craves predictability because it feels safe. Patterns reduce effort and conserve energy. When something unexpected happens, that sense of safety is disturbed, triggering confusion and heightened attention. In that moment, the mind searches for clarity and direction, becoming unusually open to external input. Emotionally, pattern interruption creates a sharp contrast. Surprise, curiosity, or mild disorientation pulls a person fully into the present moment. Thoughts pause, reactions slow, and habitual responses dissolve. The brain hasn't yet decided how to respond, and that uncertainty makes it highly suggestible. This effect is powerful because it bypasses conscious resistance. Instead of arguing with beliefs or pushing against expectations, it sidesteps them entirely. The interruption resets the emotional tone of the interaction, allowing a new direction to be introduced before the old one reestablishes itself. Once the pattern is broken, whatever follows feels more significant. Words carry more weight, suggestions feel more impactful, and emotional cues sink deeper. The mind, eager to regain balance, accepts guidance to reorient itself. In that brief psychological gap, influence feels natural rather than forced, because the brain is no longer clinging to habit, but reaching for stability. Behavioral priming. Behavioral priming is the psychological process of influencing actions by subtly preparing the mind before a decision is ever consciously made. It works by exposing a person to certain words, images, emotions, or environments that activate related thoughts and behaviors beneath awareness. By the time a choice appears, the mind has already been gently nudged in a specific direction. The brain is constantly forming associations, linking concepts together to predict what comes next. When a particular idea is activated, related behaviors become easier to access. A person may feel that their response is spontaneous or natural unaware that it was quietly rehearsed moments earlier. The action feels self-generated, which makes it powerful and difficult to resist. Emotion strengthens this effect. When priming is paired with a mood, that emotional state becomes part of the behavioral pathway. Calm primes lead to compliance. Urgency primes lead to impulsive action, and warmth primes lead to trust. The mind doesn't separate emotion from behavior. It blends them into a single impulse. What makes behavioral priming so effective is its subtlety. There is no direct request, no obvious persuasion. The influence happens before awareness activates, shaping perception and readiness. By the time the moment arrives, resistance feels unnatural, almost unnecessary. Because the primed behavior feels internally motivated, people rarely question it. They believe they are acting freely, guided by instinct or preference. In reality, the groundwork was laid quietly, and the behavior simply followed the path that had already been made familiar, comfortable, and emotionally aligned. Familiarity bias. Familiarity bias is the psychological tendency to favor what feels known, recognizable, or repeated, even when better alternatives exist. The human brain is wired to associate familiarity with safety. What we've seen before feels less threatening, less risky, and more trustworthy, regardless of objective value. Comfort quietly overrides logic. This bias forms because the mind is constantly protecting itself from uncertainty. New information demands energy, evaluation, and risk assessment. Familiar information does not. When something feels recognizable, the brain relaxes. That relaxation creates a subtle emotional reward, reinforcing preference without conscious approval. Emotionally, familiarity creates warmth. Repetition builds a sense of belonging and predictability. The more often something is encountered, the more the brain assumes it must be important, accepted, or true. This is why repeated messages feel credible over time and why people develop attachments to routines, brands, ideas, and even harmful patterns simply because they are known. Familiarity bias also dulls skepticism. When something feels routine, the mind stops questioning it. Critical thinking fades into passive acceptance. The known feels easier to defend than the unknown feels to explore. Even discomfort can become comforting if it is consistent. This bias is especially powerful in emotional decision-making. People return to familiar relationships, familiar narratives, and familiar beliefs because they promise predictability. The brain mistakes repetition for reliability and exposure for evidence. Over time, familiarity shapes identity. What feels known becomes part of the self, and rejecting it feels like loss. The mind clings to what it recognizes, not because it is right, but because it feels safe enough to stop searching. Gradual desensitization. Gradual desensitization is the process of slowly reducing emotional resistance by exposing the mind to something in small, controlled increments. What once felt uncomfortable, alarming, or unacceptable begins to feel familiar, then tolerable, and eventually normal. The change is so slow that the individual rarely notices it happening. The human brain adapts quickly to repeated stimuli. When something no longer triggers a strong emotional response, the mind stops treating it as a threat. Each small exposure lowers sensitivity just enough that the next step feels only slightly different from the last. Because there is no sharp emotional spike, there is no clear moment where alarm bells go off. Emotionally, this creates a quiet shift in boundaries. What once caused tension now causes neutrality. What once felt wrong now feels ordinary. The mind interprets familiarity as safety, even when the content itself has not changed. Comfort grows not from approval, but from repetition. This technique is powerful because resistance depends on contrast. When change is sudden, it shocks the nervous system. When change is gradual, the nervous system adapts instead of resisting. People adjust their standards to match their current environment, often believing the shift was their own idea. Over time, the original emotional reaction fades from memory. The person may even struggle to understand why they once felt strongly at all. Gradual desensitization doesn't argue, persuade, or force. It simply waits, and as time passes, the absence of discomfort is mistaken for acceptance, allowing influence to deepen quietly and without confrontation. Expectation setting. Expectation setting is the psychological process of shaping what someone believes will happen before it actually does. The human mind is not a neutral observer of reality. It actively predicts outcomes and then filters experiences to match those predictions. Once an expectation is established, the brain begins preparing emotionally and mentally to confirm it. This works because expectations act as internal instructions. They guide attention, influence interpretation, and determine emotional reactions. When someone expects something to be positive, neutral experiences feel better. When they expect difficulty, even small challenges feel heavier. The expectation quietly becomes the lens through which reality is experienced. Emotionally, expectation setting creates momentum. Anticipation can generate excitement, anxiety, hope, or caution long before any real event occurs. Those emotions don't wait for confirmation. They begin shaping perception immediately. The mind becomes invested in the outcome it has been primed to expect. Once an expectation takes hold, the brain resists information that contradicts it. Disconfirmation feels uncomfortable, like friction against an internal narrative already in motion. As a result, people unconsciously reinterpret events to preserve the expectation rather than question it. This technique is powerful because it operates ahead of logic. By the time reality unfolds, the emotional groundwork has already been laid. Reactions feel justified, even inevitable. Expectation setting doesn't force belief. It prepares the mind so thoroughly that belief feels like a natural conclusion, arising smoothly from what was already assumed to be true. Emotional anchoring. Emotional anchoring is the process of attaching a specific emotion to a person, moment, or idea so that the feeling resurfaces automatically whenever that trigger appears again. Once the anchor is set, the emotion no longer needs to be recreated consciously. It activates on its own, pulling the person back into the same emotional state without effort or awareness. The human brain stores experiences emotionally before it stores them logically. When a strong feeling is present, comfort, fear, excitement, relief, the mind links that emotion to whatever is nearby at the time. Later, even a subtle reminder can reactivate the original feeling, making it feel immediate and real, regardless of the current situation. This works because emotions bypass rational filters. When an emotional anchor is triggered, the body responds first. Heart rate shifts, muscles relax or tense, and the mind follows by justifying the feeling after it has already taken hold. Logic becomes secondary to the emotional memory that has been reawakened. Emotionally, anchoring creates familiarity. Familiar emotions feel trustworthy, even when they are misplaced. A person may feel drawn to someone not because of what they are doing now, but because of how they once made them feel. That pull can be intense, persistent, and difficult to explain. When emotional anchoring is used deliberately, it can create loyalty, attachment, or dependency. The emotion becomes tied to presence, absence, or approval. Over time, the anchor strengthens through repetition, making the emotional response faster and deeper until the feeling arrives before thought, guiding behavior automatically. Social proof illusion. Social proof illusion is the psychological effect where people believe an idea, behavior, or decision is correct simply because it appears widely accepted. Humans are deeply social creatures, and the brain is wired to look to others for cues on how to think, feel, and act. When many people seem to agree on something, the mind interprets consensus as safety. This illusion works because isolation feels dangerous on a subconscious level. Agreeing with the group reduces social risk, even when the group is wrong. Emotionally, alignment feels comforting. It provides reassurance that one is not alone, not mistaken, not exposed. That comfort often overrides independent judgment. The illusion forms when signals of popularity are emphasized. Numbers, repetition, confident voices, and visible approval create the impression of mass agreement. The brain rarely checks whether that agreement is real or manufactured. It reacts to the feeling of majority, not the truth behind it. Emotion plays a critical role here. Social proof triggers fear of exclusion and desire for belonging at the same time. Disagreeing suddenly feels uncomfortable, even threatening. The mind begins to rationalize acceptance to avoid internal tension. What feels popular starts to feel correct. Once the illusion takes hold, resistance weakens. People assume others have already done the thinking, reducing the need to question. Skepticism feels unnecessary, even rude. Trust is transferred from evidence to perception. Over time, repeated exposure to apparent consensus reshapes belief. The idea no longer feels external, it feels normal. Social proof illusion doesn't convince through logic, it persuades through belonging. The strongest influence comes not from what is said, but from the quiet suggestion that everyone else already agrees. Strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity is the deliberate use of vagueness to keep meaning flexible and control interpretation. Instead of offering clear answers, it leaves just enough uncertainty for the mind to fill in the gaps. Humans are uncomfortable with unanswered questions, and when clarity is withheld, the brain instinctively works to resolve the tension on its own. This technique exploits the mind's need for coherence. When information is incomplete, people project their own assumptions, fears, or desires onto what is missing. The ambiguity becomes personal, shaped by the listener's internal world rather than the speaker's words. This makes the message feel tailored, even though nothing specific was said. Emotionally, strategic ambiguity creates anticipation and unease at the same time. The lack of clarity keeps attention locked in place. People listen more closely, replay conversations, and search for hidden meaning. The mind stays engaged because uncertainty feels unresolved, and unresolved thoughts demand energy. Ambiguity also protects the source of influence. Because nothing explicit is stated, there is nothing concrete to challenge. If questioned, meanings can be adjusted, denied, or reframed. This flexibility allows control without accountability, guidance without commitment. Over time, repeated exposure to strategic ambiguity trains people to seek cues rather than answers. They become dependent on tone, timing, and implication. The influence deepens as the listener begins to interpret silence as intention and uncertainty as depth. What feels like mystery becomes authority, and what feels unclear begins to feel powerful simply because it refuses to be defined. Attention redirection. Attention redirection is the psychological act of guiding focus away from one point and toward another, subtly deciding what the mind engages with and what it ignores. Human attention is limited, and whatever occupies it feels important, urgent, and real. What falls outside of awareness fades, regardless of its actual significance. The brain cannot deeply process multiple focal points at once. When attention is redirected, perception follows. Emotion, judgment, and memory all reorganize around the new focus. This means influence doesn't require changing reality, only changing where awareness rests. Emotionally, attention redirection creates relief or urgency depending on where it leads. Shifting focus away from discomfort can feel calming, while drawing attention toward a specific concern can amplify its emotional weight. The mind trusts whatever it is currently focused on because attention signals relevance. This technique works best when the redirection feels natural. Sudden shifts paired with emotional cues capture awareness before resistance forms. Curiosity, reassurance, or subtle alarm can pull focus effortlessly, bypassing conscious choice. Over time, repeated redirection conditions the mind to follow certain cues automatically. People believe they are choosing what matters, unaware that their attention is being guided. Once focus is controlled, emotional reactions and decisions often follow without question. Influence deepens not by force, but by quietly deciding what the mind sees, feels, and considers worth responding to in the first place. Microaffirmations. Microaffirmations are small, almost unnoticeable signals of approval that quietly shape how a person feels about themselves in your presence. They are brief glances, subtle nods, slight smiles, short verbal acknowledgments, or moments of attentive silence that communicate validation without ever stating it directly. Because they are understated, they slip past conscious defenses and land directly in the emotional core. The human mind is constantly searching for cues about belonging and acceptance. When microaffirmations are present, the nervous system interprets them as signs of safety. The person feels seen without being exposed, approved of without being evaluated. That feeling is deeply comforting, and comfort is one of the strongest drivers of attachment. Emotionally, microaffirmations work by reinforcing identity. Each small signal tells the brain, "You're doing this right," or "You're welcome here." Over time, these signals accumulate, creating a quiet sense of confidence and connection that feels organic and earned. The person begins to associate you with reassurance, stability, and emotional ease. What makes microaffirmations so powerful is their deniability. They don't feel manipulative because they don't feel intentional, yet they subtly reward certain behaviors, opinions, or emotional expressions, guiding how someone shows up without overt direction. The brain naturally repeats what feels good. As this pattern continues, people unconsciously seek more of that validation. They speak more openly, align more closely, and value the approval of the person providing it. The influence grows quietly, not through pressure or praise, but through the steady drip of emotional reinforcement that feels natural, safe, and deeply human. Perceived scarcity. Perceived scarcity is a psychological trigger that activates when something feels limited, rare, or at risk of disappearing. The moment the mind believes access is restricted, desire intensifies. Scarcity creates urgency, and urgency compresses rational thought. What once felt optional suddenly feels necessary. This happens because the brain equates scarcity with value. If something is hard to obtain, the mind assumes it must be important. Evolutionarily, limited resources meant survival depended on acting quickly. That ancient wiring still exists, pushing people to prioritize speed over reflection when availability feels threatened. Emotionally, perceived scarcity generates tension and fear of loss. The idea of missing out creates discomfort stronger than the pleasure of gaining something new. The brain becomes focused on avoiding regret rather than evaluating truth. In that state, hesitation feels dangerous and delay feels costly. Scarcity also narrows attention. When something seems limited, competing thoughts fade into the background. The mind fixates on the scarce object, replaying its importance and imagining the consequences of losing access. This fixation amplifies emotional intensity and suppresses doubt. The effect grows stronger when scarcity is paired with time pressure or social comparison. Knowing others might gain access first heightens urgency and taps into competitive instincts. The decision becomes emotional rather than logical, driven by impulse and imagined loss. Once perceived scarcity takes hold, people often act against their own interests, just to relieve the internal pressure it creates. The relief of securing access feels like safety restored. Scarcity doesn't persuade by explaining value. It manufactures it by making absence feel unbearable, turning limitation into desire and urgency into compliance. Compliance momentum. Compliance momentum is the psychological effect that occurs when a person becomes increasingly likely to agree the more times they have already said yes. Each small act of compliance lowers resistance for the next one, creating a sense of continuity that the mind feels compelled to maintain. What begins as a harmless agreement slowly turns into a pattern that feels difficult to interrupt. The human brain values consistency. Once it commits to a direction, changing course creates discomfort. Saying no after a series of yeses feels like breaking an internal promise, even if no such promise was consciously made. The mind prefers alignment over conflict, and compliance momentum exploits that preference. Emotionally, each agreement reinforces a subtle identity shift. The person begins to see themselves as cooperative, reasonable, or aligned with whoever initiated the request. That self-image becomes something the mind wants to protect. Refusing later feels not just like rejecting an action, but rejecting who they have become in the interaction. This technique works because resistance is strongest at the beginning. Once the initial barrier is crossed, subsequent steps feel smaller by comparison. The emotional cost of stopping grows with every step forward. Momentum replaces evaluation, and movement replaces thought. As compliance builds, people stop reassessing the situation and start focusing on maintaining flow. They mistake familiarity for comfort and progress for intention. By the time awareness returns, the path already feels chosen, not because it was forced, but because it was taken one agreeable step at a time. Trust acceleration. Trust acceleration is the psychological process of creating a sense of safety and reliability faster than it would naturally develop. Under normal circumstances, trust is built slowly through repeated exposure and consistent behavior. When accelerated, that timeline is compressed, making familiarity and confidence appear before they have been fully earned. The human brain is constantly assessing threat and safety. When cues of trust appear early, such as openness, confidence, or perceived understanding, the nervous system relaxes, emotional tension lowers, skepticism weakens, and the mind shifts from defense to receptivity. That shift often happens quietly, without conscious approval. Emotionally, accelerated trust feels like relief. It removes the burden of caution and replaces it with comfort. People begin to feel as though they just know someone is safe, even if that feeling has no concrete basis. Familiar emotions are mistaken for genuine connection, and comfort is mistaken for truth. This effect is intensified when vulnerability is mirrored or when personal information is exchanged early. The brain interprets emotional openness as sincerity, creating a false sense of mutual understanding. Once that bond forms, questioning feels unnecessary and even disloyal. As trust accelerates, boundaries soften. People share more, listen more closely, and accept guidance with less resistance. The mind prefers emotional ease over uncertainty, and once trust feels established, it resists reevaluating it. Influence grows not through proof, but through the emotional certainty that safety has already been confirmed. Implied consensus. Implied consensus is the psychological technique of making an idea feel widely accepted without ever proving that it is. Instead of stating facts or citing agreement directly, it subtly suggests that most people already think this way, behave this way, or understand this truth. The human mind is deeply influenced by social belonging, and when something feels collectively accepted, resistance begins to fade. This works because the brain is wired to avoid isolation. Being out of alignment with the group once meant danger, exclusion, or loss of safety. Even now, that ancient fear lingers beneath awareness. When a belief is framed as common or assumed, questioning it feels uncomfortable, almost socially risky, even in private thought. Emotionally, implied consensus creates reassurance. It tells the listener they are not alone, not strange, not mistaken for agreeing. The idea feels safer because it feels shared. People relax into agreement not because they are convinced, but because agreement feels normal. Language plays a key role. Phrases that suggest familiarity or shared understanding quietly guide perception. The mind fills in gaps, assuming there must be evidence or agreement somewhere, even if none is presented. That assumption becomes self-reinforcing. Once implied consensus takes hold, the brain shifts from evaluation to alignment. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" it asks, "How do I fit into this?" Doubt begins to feel like deviation rather than discernment. Over time, repeated exposure strengthens the illusion, making the belief feel established and unquestionable. The power lies not in persuasion, but in making disagreement feel unnecessary, awkward, or already resolved before it is ever voiced. Emotional labeling. Emotional labeling is the act of naming or defining another person's emotional state, often before they have fully processed it themselves. When an emotion is labeled, it becomes more concrete, more real, and harder to escape. The mind instinctively seeks clarity during emotional uncertainty, and a label offers structure in moments of internal chaos. This technique works because emotions are often felt before they are understood. When someone is told what they are feeling, especially in moments of confusion or intensity, the brain tends to accept the label as guidance. Once accepted, the emotion stabilizes around that definition. The person begins to experience the feeling in the way it has been described, even if it originally existed in a different form. Emotionally, labeling creates relief. Unnamed feelings are unsettling, but named emotions feel manageable. The mind relaxes when confusion is replaced with certainty. That relief builds trust toward the source of the label because they appear perceptive, empathetic, and emotionally intelligent. Emotional labeling also shapes behavior. When a feeling is defined as stress, guilt, excitement, or fear, the brain subconsciously adjusts responses to match what it believes that emotion requires. The label becomes a script. Actions begin to align with the named feeling rather than the original experience. This technique is powerful because it bypasses logic and speaks directly to identity. People don't just feel emotions, they become them. Once an emotion is labeled, rejecting it feels like denying one's own internal truth. When used carefully, emotional labeling can help people feel understood and grounded. When used manipulatively, it can redirect emotions, amplify vulnerability, or steer reactions without resistance. The mind clings to the label because it feels seen, even if the label quietly reshapes what is actually being felt. Narrative control. Narrative control is the ability to shape how events are understood by deciding which story is told, how it begins, and what meaning is assigned to it. Humans don't experience reality as raw facts. They experience it as stories that explain cause, intention, and outcome. Whoever controls the narrative controls the emotional interpretation of what happens. The mind seeks coherence. It wants events to make sense, to fit into a sequence with a beginning, a reason, and an implied conclusion. When a narrative is provided, the brain relaxes. It stops searching for alternative explanations because the story already offers emotional closure, even if the details are incomplete. Emotionally, narrative control directs blame, sympathy, and trust. By emphasizing certain elements and omitting others, it quietly tells the listener how to feel. Characters are framed as victims, heroes, or threats long before facts are questioned. Once emotions are assigned, logic follows obediently behind. This technique is powerful because stories bypass analytical defenses. People don't argue with narratives the same way they argue with data. They absorb them, relate to them, and remember them. Over time, repeated narratives become beliefs, and beliefs begin to feel like personal truth. When narrative control is consistent, alternative perspectives start to feel confusing or wrong. The mind resists disrupting a story it already understands. In that resistance, influence deepens. The listener doesn't just accept the version presented, they begin to defend it, protect it, and retell it, unknowingly reinforcing the very structure that shaped their perception in the first place. Selective disclosure. Selective disclosure is the psychological technique of revealing certain pieces of information while intentionally withholding others, shaping perception through controlled transparency. What is shared feels meaningful, and what is hidden quietly disappears from consideration. The human mind assumes that what is revealed represents the whole, rarely questioning what might be missing. This works because disclosure creates a sense of intimacy. When someone shares information, especially personal or emotionally charged details, it triggers trust and curiosity. The listener feels included, as though they are being given special access. That emotional response lowers skepticism and increases engagement, even when the disclosure is carefully curated. Emotionally, selective disclosure creates imbalance. The listener feels closer, more invested, and more informed than they truly are. Each revealed detail builds momentum, encouraging attention and attachment. At the same time, withheld information remains invisible, preventing the mind from forming a complete or critical picture. The brain fills in gaps automatically. When information is missing, assumptions rush in to complete the narrative, often in favor of the person disclosing. Those assumptions feel self-generated, which makes them feel trustworthy. Influence becomes stronger because the conclusions don't feel imposed. Over time, selective disclosure controls the emotional pacing of a relationship or interaction. Curiosity is sustained, trust is reinforced, and perception is guided without force. What is shown feels deliberate and honest, while what is hidden quietly shapes outcomes by never entering awareness at all. Perception. Shaping. Perception shaping is the psychological process of influencing how reality is interpreted rather than changing reality itself. It works by guiding attention, emotion, and meaning so that certain details feel important while others fade into the background. The mind does not experience the world objectively. It experiences a filtered version shaped by focus, expectation, and emotional tone. The brain is constantly deciding what matters and what doesn't. When perception is subtly guided, those decisions are made for it. What is highlighted feels significant, urgent, or meaningful. What is ignored feels irrelevant or unworthy of attention. Over time, this creates a version of reality that feels self-evident, even though it was quietly constructed. Emotion is the engine behind this effect. When perception is paired with feeling, it becomes believable. Fear sharpens focus, comfort softens scrutiny, and excitement narrows attention toward possibility. The emotional state determines how information is interpreted long before logic steps in. Perception shaping often happens through repetition, tone, and framing. The same idea encountered repeatedly begins to feel familiar, and familiarity is often mistaken for truth. The mind trusts what it recognizes, even if it doesn't remember learning it. As perception shifts, behavior follows naturally. People act in ways that make sense within the reality they believe they are seeing. Because the change feels internal, not imposed, resistance rarely forms. By the time awareness arises, the perception already feels settled, and questioning it feels like questioning reality itself. Repetition effect. The repetition effect is a psychological phenomenon where repeated exposure to an idea, phrase, or message increases its perceived truth, importance, and acceptability. The mind begins to equate familiarity with accuracy, slowly lowering its defenses each time the same information appears. What is heard once may be questioned, but what is heard repeatedly starts to feel reliable. This happens because the brain is designed to conserve energy. Processing new information requires effort, while familiar information feels easy. That ease creates a subtle emotional comfort. The mind interprets this comfort as a sign that the information is safe, valid, or already verified. Over time, repetition replaces evaluation. Emotionally, repetition builds trust without demanding proof. Each encounter reinforces a sense of recognition, and recognition feels reassuring. The message stops triggering alertness and starts blending into the background of accepted reality. Doubt fades, not because questions were answered, but because questioning feels unnecessary. The repetition effect is especially powerful when paired with consistency in tone. When the same idea is delivered calmly, confidently, and without variation, it begins to feel stable. Stability creates emotional grounding, and emotionally grounded ideas are rarely challenged. As repetition continues, the message integrates into memory. It becomes harder to remember where the idea originated and easier to assume it has always been true. The mind defends repeated information more strongly than new alternatives because abandoning it would create discomfort. This effect subtly reshapes belief systems. People begin to repeat the message themselves, reinforcing it internally. What started as external influence becomes self-sustained. The repetition effect doesn't persuade through force or logic, but through quiet persistence, allowing exposure to do the work until acceptance feels natural and resistance feels oddly unfamiliar. Framing contrast. Framing contrast is a psychological technique that shapes perception by placing one idea, option, or situation next to another in a way that exaggerates their differences. The human mind does not evaluate things in isolation. It compares. When two frames are presented back to back, the second is judged not on its own value, but in relation to the first. This works because perception is relative. A choice can feel reasonable, safe, or even desirable simply because it follows something framed as extreme, risky, or undesirable. The contrast creates emotional relief. The mind moves away from discomfort toward whatever feels calmer, simpler, or less threatening, even if that option would not have been appealing on its own. Emotionally, framing contrast manipulates scale. What once felt like a loss can feel like a gain. What once felt demanding can feel easy. The nervous system reacts to the emotional drop between the two frames, mistaking relief for correctness. That relief becomes the deciding factor. This technique is especially powerful when the first frame triggers fear, stress, or tension. The second frame then feels like an escape. The brain is drawn to resolution, and contrast provides it instantly. Logic steps aside while emotion takes the lead. Over time, repeated use of framing contrast conditions people to accept outcomes they might otherwise resist. Their standards quietly shift, anchored not to objective value, but to whatever comparison was placed before them. Perception bends toward the calmer option, unaware that the calm was carefully engineered through contrast rather than truth. Cognitive ease. Cognitive ease is the psychological state in which information feels simple, familiar, and effortless to process. When the mind experiences ease, it interprets that smoothness as truth, safety, and reliability. The brain equates comfort with correctness, even when no evidence supports that assumption. This happens because the human mind is wired to conserve energy. Thinking deeply requires effort, and effort feels like friction. When information flows easily, without confusion or strain, the brain relaxes. That relaxation produces a subtle emotional warmth, making ideas feel trustworthy simply because they are easy to accept. Emotionally, cognitive ease reduces alertness. When nothing feels challenging or threatening, skepticism fades. Repetition, clear language, and familiar patterns all contribute to this effect. The more often something is encountered in a comfortable form, the more true it begins to feel, regardless of accuracy. Cognitive ease also shapes memory. Ideas processed effortlessly are remembered more favorably and recalled with less doubt. The mind prefers what feels fluent and coherent, mistaking clarity for validity. This makes people more likely to agree, comply, or align without recognizing why. Over time, cognitive ease creates a powerful illusion of certainty. The absence of struggle feels like understanding. The absence of resistance feels like agreement. In that mental smoothness, critical thinking quietly disengages, and belief settles in, not because it was examined, but because it felt good to accept. Suggestibility window. The suggestibility window is a psychological state in which the mind becomes temporarily more open, receptive, and vulnerable to influence. It appears during moments of emotional intensity, fatigue, uncertainty, transition, or relief, when the brain loosens its usual defenses and stops scrutinizing information as carefully. In these moments, suggestions slip in quietly, often unnoticed. This happens because the mind cannot maintain high vigilance at all times. When emotional or cognitive resources are depleted, the brain shifts into a passive mode, prioritizing ease and resolution over analysis. It wants stability. It wants direction. Suggestions offered during this window feel less like persuasion and more like guidance. Emotion plays a critical role in opening this window. Stress, excitement, fear, comfort, or exhaustion all soften resistance in different ways. After a tense moment, relief creates openness. During confusion, clarity feels magnetic. When tired, certainty feels soothing. The brain becomes less concerned with questioning intent and more focused on restoring balance. What makes the suggestibility window powerful is its timing. The same message rejected earlier may be accepted effortlessly when delivered at the right moment. The content doesn't change, only the state of the listener. In that state, agreement feels natural, almost automatic. Because the influence occurs during an altered mental state, people often believe the idea was their own. They remember deciding, not being guided. By the time the window closes and critical thinking returns, the suggestion has already integrated, settling into belief, memory, or behavior as if it belonged there all along. Timing. Manipulation. Timing manipulation is the strategic use of when information, requests, or emotional triggers are introduced in order to maximize influence. The same message can feel harmless or overwhelming, depending entirely on the moment it arrives. Human perception is deeply affected by mental state, emotional readiness, and environmental pressure, and timing exploits those fluctuations. This technique works because the mind is not consistently alert or resistant. There are moments when attention is low, emotions are heightened, or fatigue has set in. During these windows, critical thinking weakens and emotional processing takes over. A suggestion introduced at the right time slips past defenses that would normally reject it. Emotionally, timing manipulation targets vulnerability, stress, relief, excitement, or exhaustion all create openings where the brain seeks guidance rather than evaluation. In these states, people are more likely to accept direction simply to maintain emotional balance. The timing feels natural, even helpful, rather than intrusive. The effect is amplified when timing aligns with transition points. Moments of change create psychological instability. The mind becomes more flexible, more suggestible, and more open to influence. Introducing ideas during these shifts allows them to anchor more deeply. Because the content itself isn't aggressive, resistance rarely activates. The influence feels subtle, almost invisible. People believe they chose freely, unaware that their mental state was already shaped before the message arrived. Over time, timing manipulation conditions behavior. Individuals associate certain moments with guidance and others with compliance. The mind begins to expect direction during vulnerable states, reinforcing the cycle. Influence becomes seamless, not because the message is stronger, but because it arrives precisely when the mind is least prepared to push back. Emotional pacing. Emotional pacing is the deliberate synchronization with another person's emotional state in order to guide where that emotion goes next. Instead of challenging or changing how someone feels, it begins by matching it. This alignment creates safety. The nervous system relaxes when it senses emotional understanding, and resistance fades when emotions feel acknowledged rather than corrected. The brain is highly sensitive to emotional mismatch. When someone responds too positively to pain or too calmly to anger, it creates disconnection. Emotional pacing avoids this by entering the same emotional rhythm as the other person. Once that rhythm is shared, it becomes easier to influence the direction of the emotional experience. Emotionally, this technique creates trust. People feel less alone in their internal state, which lowers their defenses. When emotions feel validated, the mind opens. From that openness, subtle shifts can be introduced, slowly steering the emotion toward calm, excitement, or compliance without triggering resistance. Emotional pacing works because feelings naturally seek resolution. When someone believes you understand how they feel, they are more willing to follow your lead out of it. The transition feels organic, not forced. The emotion moves because it wants to, not because it is pushed. This method is powerful in persuasion, conflict resolution, and influence because it operates beneath awareness. The person feels guided, not controlled. By the time the emotional state changes, it feels self-generated. The influence is invisible, and the emotional journey feels natural, even though it was carefully paced from the very beginning. Subconscious cueing. Subconscious cueing is the use of subtle signals that influence thoughts, emotions, or behavior without entering conscious awareness. These cues slip past logic and speak directly to the automatic parts of the brain that govern instinct, association, and emotional response. Because the mind does not register them as deliberate influence, it does not resist them. The brain is constantly absorbing information below the surface of awareness. Tone, rhythm, repetition, imagery, and timing all act as quiet messengers. A certain word choice can trigger comfort. A pause can create anticipation. A familiar pattern can generate trust. The conscious mind believes it is deciding freely, while the subconscious is already leaning in a specific direction. Emotionally, subconscious cueing feels like intuition. People experience reactions without knowing their source. A sense of ease, urgency, attraction, or unease appears suddenly and feels self-generated. Because the feeling seems to come from within, it is rarely questioned. This technique works by forming associations. When a cue is repeatedly paired with an emotion or outcome, the brain links them automatically. Over time, the cue alone is enough to trigger the response. The person reacts before thought has time to intervene. Subconscious cueing is powerful, precisely because it is invisible. There is no argument to reject, no claim to analyze. Influence happens quietly, shaping perception while preserving the illusion of independence. The mind moves where it feels drawn, unaware that the pull was planted long before the decision ever felt real. Psychological ownership. Psychological ownership is the feeling that something belongs to you, even when it legally or physically does not. The moment the mind claims ownership, emotional attachment forms. What feels mine becomes protected, valued, and defended automatically, often without conscious reasoning. This effect works because ownership is deeply tied to identity. When people feel connected to an idea, decision, or outcome, rejecting it feels like rejecting a part of themselves. The brain doesn't treat owned things as neutral objects. It treats them as extensions of the self. That emotional bond increases commitment and lowers skepticism. Emotionally, psychological ownership creates pride, responsibility, and fear of loss. Once someone believes they had a role in shaping something, they become invested in its success. Even small involvement is enough. A choice suggested feels optional, but a choice partially created feels personal. The difference is subtle, yet powerful. This technique often forms by inviting participation rather than giving instruction. When people are asked for opinions, feedback, or small contributions, the mind quietly claims stake. What follows feels less like persuasion and more like follow-through. Resistance fades because opposition would contradict the self-image of involvement. As ownership deepens, people rationalize flaws and defend outcomes they helped shape. They reinterpret information to protect what feels theirs. The emotional pull becomes stronger than objective evaluation. Psychological ownership doesn't demand loyalty, it creates it. Once the sense of mine takes hold, influence no longer feels external. It feels chosen, internal, and worth standing behind, even when the original direction was never truly theirs to begin with. Familiar rhythm. Familiar rhythm is the psychological comfort created when patterns of speech, behavior, or interaction repeat in a predictable way. The human brain is deeply attuned to rhythm because rhythm signals safety. What is predictable feels controllable, and what feels controllable feels calm. When a rhythm is established, the mind relaxes into it without conscious effort. This technique works because repetition reduces cognitive load. The brain no longer needs to stay alert for surprises. Instead, it begins to anticipate what comes next, conserving energy and lowering defenses. Familiar rhythm gently quiets internal noise, making people more receptive to whatever is layered within the pattern. Emotionally, rhythm creates a sense of belonging. It feels like being carried rather than pushed. People begin to associate the rhythm with ease, comfort, and stability. Once that association forms, breaking the rhythm feels uncomfortable, even unsettling. The mind prefers to stay inside what it recognizes. Familiar rhythm is often established through consistent tone, pacing, or structure. The content may change, but the delivery stays the same. This consistency builds trust without requiring proof. The nervous system responds to the rhythm itself, not the message. Over time, influence hides inside the pattern. Because the rhythm feels safe, messages pass through with less resistance. People stop listening actively and start absorbing passively. The rhythm becomes the guide, and within that steady familiarity, perception softens, attention narrows, and the mind drifts into acceptance without realizing when it stopped questioning. Validation loops. Validation loops are a psychological pattern where approval, acknowledgement, or emotional affirmation is given in a way that encourages repeated behavior. When someone feels validated, the brain releases a subtle sense of reward. That reward becomes something the mind wants to experience again, quietly shaping future actions without the need for direct instruction. Humans are deeply driven by the need to feel seen and accepted. Validation signals safety, belonging, and worth. When it is delivered consistently in response to certain behaviors, opinions, or emotional expressions, the mind begins to associate those actions with emotional relief. The loop forms when the individual unconsciously repeats what earned validation before. Emotionally, validation loops create dependency. The person starts to monitor themselves, adjusting tone, thoughts, or choices to maintain the feeling of approval. Over time, internal judgment weakens, and external affirmation takes its place. What feels good begins to feel right, even if it conflicts with personal values. This technique is powerful because it feels positive, not coercive. There is no pressure, no demand, only warmth and recognition. That makes it difficult to question. The absence of validation later can feel unsettling, creating a quiet anxiety that pulls the person back into the loop. As the cycle continues, behavior becomes shaped by anticipation of approval rather than conscious decision-making. The individual feels understood and supported, unaware that their emotional responses are being conditioned. The loop sustains itself through reassurance and reward, subtly guiding actions while maintaining the comforting illusion of choice. Predictive signaling. Predictive signaling is the act of subtly implying what will happen next in order to shape expectations and behavior before a choice is consciously made. The human brain is constantly trying to anticipate the future, and when a signal suggests an outcome, the mind begins preparing for it emotionally and mentally. That preparation makes the predicted outcome feel more natural when it arrives. This technique works because expectation influences perception. When people believe something is likely to happen, they adjust their behavior in ways that increase its chances. The signal doesn't command action. It quietly frames a future that feels already in motion. The brain, seeking efficiency, follows the path it believes is unfolding. Emotionally, predictive signaling reduces uncertainty. The mind finds comfort in knowing what comes next, even if the outcome is not ideal. Familiar futures feel safer than unknown ones. Once an expectation is set, resisting it creates tension, while aligning with it feels smooth and effortless. Predictive signals can be delivered through tone, timing, or implication. A casual remark about what usually happens or what someone will probably feel plants a mental image. That image lingers, guiding attention and behavior toward its realization. Over time, repeated predictive signaling trains people to follow suggested outcomes without questioning their origin. They begin to experience events as inevitable rather than influenced. By the time the moment arrives, the decision feels obvious, not because it was chosen freely, but because it was emotionally rehearsed long before it ever occurred. Comfort conditioning. Comfort conditioning is the process of associating a person, idea, or presence with feelings of safety, ease, and emotional relief. Over time, the brain learns to link comfort not to the situation itself, but to the source consistently present when that comfort is felt. What begins as a neutral association slowly turns into emotional dependence. The human nervous system is always scanning for stability. When stress or uncertainty fades in someone's presence, the brain takes note. That relief becomes a signal. The mind remembers where it felt calm and seeks to return there, especially during moments of discomfort or vulnerability. Emotionally, comfort conditioning creates attachment. The absence of tension feels like protection. The individual doesn't just enjoy the comfort, they begin to crave it. The presence associated with that calm becomes a safe anchor, and distance from it can subtly trigger unease. This technique works because emotions imprint faster than logic. The brain may not remember exact words or actions, but it remembers how it felt. Repeated exposure to comfort builds familiarity, and familiarity becomes trust. Trust lowers defenses, making influence feel natural rather than imposed. Over time, the conditioned comfort reshapes behavior. People gravitate toward what soothes them, even if they can't explain why. They seek reassurance from the same source, accept guidance more easily, and resist questioning what feels emotionally safe. Comfort conditioning doesn't control through fear or force. It controls through relief, teaching the mind that peace exists in one place, and slowly making everything else feel less secure by comparison. Mental fatigue leverage. Mental fatigue leverage is the use of exhaustion as a gateway to influence. When the mind is tired, its ability to question, resist, and evaluate weakens. Decision-making becomes heavier, slower, and emotionally driven. In that drained state, people stop striving for the best choice and start reaching for the easiest one. The brain relies on energy to maintain skepticism and self-control. As that energy depletes, shortcuts take over. Thoughts blur together, patience thins, and the desire to end effort becomes stronger than the desire to be correct. Fatigue shifts priorities from accuracy to relief. Emotionally, mental exhaustion creates vulnerability. Small requests feel larger, boundaries feel harder to defend, and clarity feels distant. The mind begins to crave guidance, certainty, or permission to stop thinking altogether. Someone who appears calm and decisive in this moment feels like an anchor in chaos. This technique works quietly because fatigue doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels personal, internal, and unavoidable. People believe they are choosing freely, unaware that their mental resources are already depleted. Resistance fades not because arguments are convincing, but because resisting feels too costly. As fatigue deepens, compliance feels soothing. Agreeing brings closure, accepting brings rest. The mind trades autonomy for quiet, mistaking surrender for peace. In that moment, influence doesn't need pressure or persuasion. It only needs to arrive when the mind is too tired to stand its ground. Emotional resonance. Emotional resonance is the ability to evoke feelings in others that align with your message, making it feel personal, meaningful, and deeply familiar. Rather than convincing through logic, it works by activating shared emotional experiences. When something resonates emotionally, it bypasses analysis and goes straight to recognition. The listener doesn't just hear it, they feel it. The human brain is wired to respond more strongly to emotion than to information. Facts are processed, but emotions are remembered. When a message mirrors feelings someone has already experienced, it creates an internal echo. That echo feels like understanding. It feels like being known. And being known lowers defenses faster than argument ever could. Emotionally, resonance creates attachment. People begin to associate the feeling itself with the source of the message. Comfort, longing, fear, hope, or relief becomes linked to the presence of the person who triggered it. This bond feels natural, as if it formed on its own, even though it was carefully evoked. This technique works because emotions seek validation. When someone hears their internal state reflected back at them, they feel aligned rather than persuaded. The message feels true not because it was proven, but because it matched something already alive inside them. Over time, emotional resonance shapes belief. Repeated emotional alignment builds trust, familiarity, and influence. The listener begins to lean in, not to be convinced, but to re-experience the feeling. The emotion becomes the anchor, and the message becomes inseparable from it, quietly guiding perception without ever asking permission. Subtle reassurance. Subtle reassurance is the quiet easing of fear, doubt, or resistance without directly addressing it. Instead of confronting anxiety head-on, it works by creating an emotional environment where worry feels unnecessary. The mind relaxes not because it was convinced, but because it no longer feels threatened. Humans are constantly scanning for signs of safety. Tone of voice, calm pacing, confident pauses, and understated certainty all signal stability to the nervous system. When those signals are present, the brain downshifts. Questions soften, urgency fades. People stop bracing for impact and begin to let their guard down. This technique is powerful because it bypasses debate. Direct reassurance can trigger skepticism, but subtle reassurance feels natural and unforced. It doesn't argue against fear, it makes fear feel out of place. The emotion dissolves quietly, without needing justification. Emotionally, subtle reassurance creates containment. The listener feels held within a stable frame, as if someone else has already assessed the risk and found it manageable. That borrowed calm becomes contagious. Once the nervous system settles, openness replaces vigilance. Subtle reassurance is often embedded in phrasing that implies normalcy or inevitability. Statements that suggest things are under control, expected, or already handled reduce the perceived need for resistance. Over time, repeated exposure conditions people to associate calm authority with trust. They stop checking for danger and start moving forward, guided by a sense of ease that feels internal, even though it was gently placed there from the outside. Expectancy bias. Expectancy bias is the psychological effect where what a person expects quietly shapes what they perceive, feel, and ultimately believe. Once an expectation is planted, the mind begins filtering reality to confirm it. Information that aligns feels obvious and true, while information that contradicts it feels confusing, wrong, or easy to dismiss. The brain does this to preserve internal consistency. Unmet expectations create tension, and tension demands effort to resolve. To avoid that discomfort, the mind leans toward interpretations that protect what it already anticipates. Emotionally, expectation becomes a lens, coloring experiences before they are fully understood. This bias is powerful because it operates before conscious thought. When someone expects confidence, danger, success, or failure, their emotional responses adjust in advance. The body reacts, the tone shifts, and perception narrows. What was expected begins to feel inevitable. Emotion plays a central role in reinforcing expectancy bias. Anticipation carries emotional weight. Hope sharpens attention toward positive signs, while fear magnifies threats. The stronger the emotion tied to the expectation, the harder it becomes to see alternatives. The mind isn't lying to itself. It is protecting emotional balance. Over time, expectancy bias becomes self-reinforcing. Expectations influence behavior, behavior influences outcomes, and outcomes appear to confirm the original belief. The loop tightens quietly. People feel as though reality proved them right, unaware that their expectations shaped the path long before evidence ever appeared. Low resistance requests. Low resistance requests are small, easy to accept actions designed to slip past the mind's natural defenses. They don't trigger suspicion because they feel reasonable, harmless, and almost effortless. The brain barely registers them as decisions, which is exactly why they work. The human mind is wired to conserve energy. When a request feels simple, the brain says yes automatically to avoid unnecessary effort. There is no emotional alarm, no sense of risk, no reason to slow down and analyze. Compliance feels like the path of least resistance, and the mind gladly takes it. Emotionally, these requests create comfort and momentum. Saying yes feels smooth. It reinforces the idea that nothing bad is happening, that the interaction is safe and cooperative. Each small agreement subtly lowers the threshold for the next one, even if the next step asks for more. Low-resistance requests also shape self-perception. After agreeing once or twice, people begin to see themselves as open, helpful, or aligned. That identity becomes something the mind wants to protect. Refusing later introduces friction, not just with the other person, but within oneself. This technique is powerful because it never confronts boundaries directly. It moves around them. By the time awareness catches up, The person has already invested attention, effort, or agreement. The request didn't feel like pressure. It felt natural. And in that naturalness, resistance dissolves quietly, allowing influence to deepen without ever feeling forced or deliberate. Consistency. Pull. Consistency pull is the psychological force that drives people to behave in ways that align with their past statements, actions, and self-image. Once someone commits to an idea, even in a small or casual way, the mind begins to protect that commitment. Changing direction creates internal tension, and the brain instinctively seeks to avoid that discomfort. Humans want to see themselves as stable, reliable, and coherent. When behavior matches past choices, it reinforces identity. When it doesn't, it creates unease. Consistency pull exploits this by making earlier actions feel like anchors. The person is no longer just making a decision. They are maintaining who they believe they are. Emotionally, this pull feels like pressure from within. Saying no later feels wrong, not because the request is unreasonable, but because it clashes with what came before. The mind reframes compliance as integrity. Agreeing again feels like staying true to oneself, even if the situation has changed. This effect strengthens when commitments are public or emotionally charged. The more visible or meaningful the initial action, the stronger the pull to remain consistent. Backtracking begins to feel embarrassing, confusing, or threatening to self-worth. Over time, consistency pull narrows perceived options. Alternatives feel less available, not logically, but emotionally. The individual continues along a path because stopping would require admitting contradiction. The behavior sustains itself, driven by the desire for internal harmony, as the mind quietly chooses alignment over reassessment and familiarity over freedom. Gradual escalation. Gradual escalation is the process of increasing intensity, commitment, or demand so slowly that each step feels insignificant on its own. The change is measured, almost unnoticeable, allowing the mind to adapt without triggering resistance. By the time awareness catches up, the situation feels far removed from where it began, yet no single moment feels responsible for the shift. The human brain is far more sensitive to sudden change than to slow movement. Abrupt demands activate fear and defense, but gradual progression feels manageable. Each step establishes a new baseline, and once that baseline is accepted, the next step appears only slightly different. The mind adjusts its expectations to match the present moment, not the original starting point. Emotionally, gradual escalation creates a sense of continuity. Stopping feels disruptive, even unreasonable, because nothing dramatic has occurred. The individual feels as though they are simply following a natural progression rather than being led somewhere intentionally. That perception reduces doubt and weakens the impulse to reassess. This technique works because commitment accumulates invisibly. With every small step forward, emotional investment grows. Turning back would mean acknowledging that earlier choices may have been mistakes, and the mind avoids that discomfort by continuing onward. Over time, what once would have felt overwhelming now feels familiar. The escalation becomes normalized through exposure rather than consent. The person believes they arrived at the current point naturally, unaware that the path was carefully paced to keep resistance low and momentum high, allowing influence to deepen without ever feeling forced. Attention narrowing. Attention narrowing is a psychological state in which the mind locks onto a limited set of details while everything else fades into the background. Under emotional pressure, stress, excitement, or urgency, the brain instinctively reduces its field of focus to conserve energy. What remains feels intensely important, while what disappears feels irrelevant, even if it isn't. This happens because the brain prioritizes survival over accuracy. When attention narrows, complexity becomes overwhelming, so the mind simplifies reality. It stops scanning broadly and starts tunneling. The selected focus becomes the center of perception, and everything outside it loses emotional weight. Emotionally, attention narrowing creates intensity. Thoughts feel sharper, reactions feel faster, and alternative perspectives feel distant or unnecessary. The person feels locked in, driven by whatever has captured their focus. In this state, nuance fades and urgency grows. Decisions are made quickly, often without reflection. This effect is powerful because it limits awareness without feeling like limitation. The individual believes they are seeing clearly, unaware that their perception has been compressed. When attention is narrowed, influence becomes easier because fewer variables are being considered. The mind isn't evaluating options, it's responding to what's directly in front of it. Over time, repeated attention narrowing conditions people to react rather than reflect. They become guided by immediate emotional signals instead of broader understanding. What captures focus begins to feel like truth itself. The absence of other information isn't noticed because the mind feels occupied, engaged, and certain, even while operating within a carefully reduced window of awareness. Semantic softening. Semantic softening is the psychological technique of altering the emotional impact of an idea by changing the words used to describe it. The meaning stays largely the same, but the emotional charge is reduced, making the idea easier to accept. Humans respond to language emotionally before they respond to it logically, and softened language slips past defenses that harsher words would immediately trigger. The brain associates certain words with threat, loss, or danger. When those words are replaced with gentler alternatives, the nervous system stays calm. A softened phrase feels less confrontational, less final, and less alarming. The mind relaxes, assuming the situation is manageable, even when the underlying reality has not changed. Emotionally, semantic softening lowers fear and guilt. It creates distance between the listener and the weight of the action being described. What might have caused hesitation now feels reasonable, even necessary. The emotional urgency fades, and with it, the instinct to resist. This technique works because the brain often confuses emotional tone with moral meaning. If something sounds mild, it feels less wrong. If it feels less wrong, it becomes easier to justify. Language reshapes perception quietly, turning sharp edges into smooth surfaces the mind can slide across without discomfort. Over time, repeated exposure to softened language reshapes internal boundaries. People stop reacting emotionally to ideas that once disturbed them. The softened terms become normal, familiar, and unremarkable. By the time the original meaning resurfaces, it no longer carries the same emotional force. The mind has already accepted it, not because it agreed, but because it was never emotionally challenged in the first place. Perceived neutrality. Perceived neutrality is the psychological impression that someone has no bias, no agenda, and no emotional stake in the outcome, even when influence is actively taking place. When a person appears neutral, the mind lowers its defenses. Suspicion fades because persuasion is expected to come from those who clearly want something, not from those who seem merely observant or detached. Humans are instinctively cautious around obvious intent. When motives are visible, the brain activates critical thinking. Perceived neutrality disarms that reflex. The absence of visible pressure feels safe. Advice feels informational rather than directional. Guidance feels optional rather than persuasive, which makes it easier to accept. Emotionally, neutrality creates trust through calmness. A neutral tone signals stability and control, suggesting clarity rather than need. People feel less manipulated because nothing appears to be pushed. This emotional ease opens the door for influence to slip in quietly, framed as insight instead of persuasion. The power of perceived neutrality lies in contrast. When one voice is emotional or invested, the neutral voice feels more credible by comparison. Its words carry weight simply because they seem untainted by desire. The mind interprets detachment as honesty, even when the detachment itself is a crafted illusion. Over time, people begin to rely on the neutral source as a reference point. They check their own reactions against it. The influence deepens not through intensity, but through restraint. By appearing to stand nowhere, perceived neutrality gains the freedom to guide everything, shaping decisions while remaining invisible to scrutiny. Emotional inertia. Emotional inertia is the tendency for an emotional state to continue once it has been set, carrying thoughts and behavior along with it, even when circumstances change. Emotions create momentum. Once the mind is moving in a particular emotional direction, stopping or reversing that movement requires conscious effort that most people never apply. The brain prefers continuity. Shifting emotional states is mentally expensive and uncomfortable, so the mind often chooses to stay with what it is already feeling rather than reassess. If someone is calm, they remain receptive. If they are anxious, they stay guarded. The emotion becomes the lens through which everything else is interpreted. Emotionally, inertia creates a sense of inevitability. Thoughts begin to align with the existing feeling, reinforcing it. Calm thoughts support calm emotions. Fearful thoughts amplify fear. This feedback loop deepens the emotional state and makes alternatives feel unnatural or forced. This technique is powerful because it removes the need for persuasion. Instead of changing how someone feels, it simply maintains it. By sustaining an emotional environment long enough, behavior begins to conform automatically. Decisions feel consistent with the current mood rather than consciously chosen. Emotional inertia is often reinforced through pacing, tone, and repetition. The longer an emotion is held steady, the harder it becomes to break. Over time, the individual forgets what prompted the feeling in the first place. They continue moving forward emotionally, guided by momentum rather than intention, unaware that the path feels chosen only because stopping would require effort they no longer feel motivated to make. Passive suggestion. Passive suggestion is the act of influencing thoughts or behavior without direct instruction, allowing ideas to slip into the mind quietly and settle as if they originated there. Instead of telling someone what to think or do, it introduces concepts gently, embedded in tone, timing, or casual language. Because nothing feels imposed, the mind doesn't resist. The brain is especially receptive to ideas that arrive without pressure. When a suggestion feels optional or incidental, it bypasses defensive thinking. Emotionally, this creates ease. The listener feels relaxed, unchallenged, and free, which lowers the instinct to question intent. In that openness, ideas take root more easily. Passive suggestion works by planting seeds rather than delivering commands. A phrase, a pause, or a subtle implication can guide perception without demanding attention. The mind fills in gaps automatically, often mistaking suggestion for intuition or personal insight. What feels self-generated feels trustworthy. Emotion plays a key role in this process. When suggestions are paired with calm, reassurance, or familiarity, the nervous system associates the idea with safety. That association makes the thought feel comfortable, even appealing. Over time, repeated passive suggestions shape preferences and expectations without triggering awareness. Because there is no obvious moment of influence, passive suggestion feels invisible. The individual believes they arrived at the thought naturally. This illusion of autonomy makes the effect powerful and enduring. Influence doesn't feel like influence at all. It feels like understanding, like realization, like something that simply makes sense, even though it was quietly guided there long before it was consciously noticed. Cognitive primacy. Cognitive primacy is the psychological effect where information encountered first holds disproportionate influence over how everything that follows is interpreted. The mind gives priority to initial input, treating it as a reference point for meaning, intention, and truth. Once this first impression is formed, later information is filtered through it, rather than evaluated independently. This happens because the brain seeks structure quickly. Early information provides a mental framework, and frameworks reduce uncertainty. Emotionally, that first input creates a sense of orientation. It tells the mind what to expect, who to trust, and how to feel before deeper analysis begins. Cognitive primacy becomes especially powerful when the first information carries emotional weight. Surprise, confidence, fear, or certainty at the beginning embeds the message deeper into memory. The emotion signals importance, and importance makes the information feel credible and stable. As new details appear, the brain doesn't reset. It adjusts. Contradictory information feels uncomfortable because it threatens the established framework. Instead of replacing the initial impression, the mind downplays, reinterprets, or ignores what doesn't fit. Consistency feels safer than correction. Over time, the first impression hardens into belief. People often confuse familiarity with accuracy, unaware that their understanding was shaped before they had all the facts. Cognitive primacy doesn't argue or persuade overtly. It quietly decides what matters first, and once that decision is made, the rest of perception follows obediently behind it. Memory shaping. Memory shaping is the subtle influence over how events are remembered, rather than how they actually occurred. Human memory is not a fixed recording. It is fluid, emotional, and constantly rewritten. Each time a memory is recalled, it becomes vulnerable to suggestion, reinterpretation, and emotional coloring. What people remember is often less about facts and more about how those facts made them feel. The brain prioritizes emotional coherence over accuracy. When memories are revisited in a specific emotional frame, the mind adjusts details to match that frame. Over time, repetition strengthens the altered version, while the original fades. The person feels confident in their memory, unaware that it has shifted. Emotion plays a central role in this process. Feelings act as glue, binding certain interpretations to the memory. If an event is repeatedly recalled with reassurance, justification, or subtle doubt, the emotional tone replaces uncertainty with clarity. The memory begins to feel resolved, even if it was once confusing or troubling. This technique works because the mind dislikes ambiguity. When a memory feels incomplete or emotionally unresolved, it causes discomfort. Memory shaping offers relief by providing meaning. That meaning doesn't have to be accurate. It only has to feel emotionally satisfying. Over time, shaped memories influence identity, beliefs, and decisions. People act based on what they believe happened, not what actually did. As memories shift, so does perception of the past, and with it, trust in one's own judgment. The most powerful part of memory shaping is that it feels self-generated, as if the mind arrived at the truth on its own, quietly rewriting history in the process. Tonal influence. Tonal influence is the power of voice tone to shape emotional response and perception before words are fully processed. Long before the mind analyzes meaning, it reacts to sound. Tone signals intent, safety, dominance, or warmth, and the nervous system responds automatically, often overriding logic entirely. The human brain evolved to prioritize vocal tone as a survival cue. A calm, steady tone signals control and reassurance. A slow, deliberate cadence suggests confidence and authority. Even when the words are neutral, tone tells the listener how to feel about what is being said. The message is carried emotionally before it is understood intellectually. Emotionally, tonal influence creates alignment or resistance instantly. A soothing tone lowers defenses and invites trust. A sharp or hurried tone triggers alertness and caution. Because these reactions happen subconsciously, people believe their response is rational, unaware that tone guided it first. This technique works because tone sets the emotional frame for interpretation. Once that frame is established, the mind adjusts meaning to fit it. Statements delivered calmly feel reasonable. The same statements delivered tensely feel threatening. The content remains unchanged, but perception shifts completely. Over time, repeated exposure to a particular tone conditions emotional responses. People begin to associate certain voices or speaking styles with safety, certainty, or credibility. They respond automatically before thought has time to intervene. Tonal influence doesn't argue or persuade. It guides emotion quietly, shaping understanding through sound alone while preserving the illusion that the words themselves carried all the power. Authority tone. Authority tone is the use of calm certainty, controlled pacing, and confident delivery to signal leadership and credibility without explicitly claiming it. The human brain is highly attuned to vocal cues, and tone often carries more weight than words themselves. When someone speaks with assurance, the mind interprets it as competence and stability. This works because uncertainty is emotionally uncomfortable. In moments of ambiguity, people instinctively look for signals of control. An authority tone provides that signal. It feels grounded, unhurried, and decisive. The absence of hesitation suggests knowledge, and the lack of emotional fluctuation suggests confidence. Even without evidence, the mind fills in credibility. Emotionally, authority tone creates safety. It quiets doubt by offering structure. The listener feels guided rather than persuaded. Resistance fades because challenging authority feels risky, especially when that authority is conveyed subtly rather than aggressively. This tone influences perception before content is processed. Statements delivered with authority feel more true, more reasonable, and more final. The brain evaluates them less critically because the emotional signal suggests there is no need to question. Certainty becomes contagious. Over time, repeated exposure to an authority tone conditions obedience. People begin to accept direction reflexively, responding to the sound of confidence rather than the substance of the message. The influence doesn't rely on force or status. It relies on emotional cues that signal control, competence, and certainty. When authority tone is consistent, it trains the mind to trust first and analyze later, allowing influence to settle in quietly and deeply without ever announcing itself. Implicit comparison. Implicit comparison is the subtle act of evaluating someone or something against another reference point without ever stating the comparison directly. Instead of saying one option is better or worse, it allows the mind to arrive at that conclusion on its own. Humans are constantly comparing, even when they believe they are judging independently, and implicit comparison quietly guides that process. The brain looks for benchmarks to make sense of value. When a reference is implied rather than declared, it feels more objective. The listener believes the judgment came from their own reasoning, not external influence. This makes the conclusion feel personal, earned, and therefore harder to question. Emotionally, implicit comparison triggers insecurity and aspiration at the same time. It activates the fear of falling behind and the desire to align with what feels superior. Because the comparison is unstated, the emotion feels self-generated. The person feels motivated, pressured, or dissatisfied without being able to point to a clear source. This technique works by shaping the emotional environment around a decision. Certain traits, outcomes, or identities are subtly framed as normal or desirable, while others are quietly positioned as lacking. The listener begins to measure themselves against an invisible standard, adjusting behavior to close a gap that was never openly defined. Over time, implicit comparison reshapes self-perception. People begin to internalize expectations that were never directly expressed. They strive, comply, or conform not because they were told to, but because not doing so feels like a personal shortcoming. The most powerful part of implicit comparison is that it never argues. It simply lets the mind compare in silence, and silence is often where the deepest pressure lives. Emotional echoing. Emotional echoing is the act of reflecting another person's emotional expressions back to them in a slightly softened, clarified, or reinforced form. Unlike simple empathy, it subtly amplifies awareness of what they are already feeling. When someone hears their emotions echoed back, it feels as though their inner experience has been externalized and confirmed. The human mind craves emotional recognition. When feelings remain unspoken or vague, they create internal tension. Emotional echoing releases that tension by giving language and shape to what is felt but not fully articulated. The moment an emotion is echoed, it feels more real, more justified, and more important. Emotionally, this creates depth. People feel understood at a level that goes beyond words. They begin to trust the person echoing them because that person seems attuned to their inner state. The echo doesn't introduce new emotion. It strengthens the existing one, making it harder to ignore or dismiss. This technique works because emotions gain momentum when they are acknowledged. An echoed feeling lingers longer in the nervous system. It feels validated, stabilized, and worthy of attention. As a result, the individual leans further into the emotion, often deepening attachment to the source of the echo. Over time, emotional echoing can guide perception by reinforcing specific emotional interpretations of events. The echoed emotion becomes the dominant lens through which situations are understood. People begin to associate clarity and emotional relief with the person reflecting them. The influence feels gentle, even supportive, yet it quietly shapes how emotions are processed, remembered, and acted upon, making the echo feel like truth rather than reflection. Calm dominance. Calm dominance is the projection of control and authority without aggression, urgency, or visible effort. It is the presence of steadiness in situations where tension is expected. The absence of emotional reactivity becomes the signal of power. When others feel pressure and you do not, the imbalance itself communicates status. The human nervous system is highly responsive to emotional contrast. In moments of uncertainty, people look for cues about how serious or threatening a situation is. When someone remains calm while others are unsettled, the brain interprets that calm as competence and control. It suggests access to knowledge, leverage, or certainty that others do not have. Emotionally, calm dominance creates gravity. People slow down around it, voices lower, attention sharpens. The steadiness draws focus because it feels stabilizing. In contrast to emotional noise, calm feels like authority without explanation. This technique works because emotions are contagious, but so is emotional absence. Calm interrupts escalation. It sets the emotional baseline that others unconsciously match. Once that baseline is established, the calm individual defines the tempo and direction of interaction without issuing commands. Over time, calm dominance conditions compliance. People begin to defer, not because they are forced, but because resistance feels chaotic and misaligned. The calm presence becomes the reference point for what is acceptable and controlled. Influence flows from stillness rather than pressure, and authority is felt rather than declared. shaping outcomes simply by refusing to react. Narrative immersion. Narrative immersion is the psychological state where the mind becomes absorbed in a story so deeply that it temporarily suspends critical distance. When immersed, people don't analyze information as facts to be judged. They experience it as reality unfolding. Emotions take the lead, and logic quietly steps aside. The human brain is wired for stories. Long before structured reasoning, stories were how meaning, danger, and belonging were understood. When a narrative is engaging, the mind stops questioning its construction and starts living inside it. Attention narrows, imagination activates, and emotional responses become stronger than intellectual ones. Emotionally, narrative immersion creates identification. The listener begins to feel what the characters feel, anticipate outcomes, and internalize the emotional stakes. This emotional alignment lowers defenses. Resistance feels like breaking the flow, and questioning feels disruptive to the experience itself. Once immersed, people accept premises they would normally challenge. Cause and effect feel natural because the story provides coherence. Even gaps or inconsistencies are glossed over because emotional engagement prioritizes continuity over accuracy. The mind prefers to stay inside the narrative rather than step outside it to evaluate. This makes narrative immersion a powerful tool for influence. Beliefs introduced within a story feel earned rather than imposed. Values feel discovered rather than taught. The listener doesn't feel persuaded, they feel moved. As immersion deepens, the boundary between story and belief softens. Emotional truths linger after the narrative ends, shaping perception and memory. The story doesn't need to argue its point. By the time awareness returns, the emotional imprint is already in place, quietly guiding thoughts, reactions, and meaning long after the narrative itself fades. Controlled disclosure. Controlled disclosure is the deliberate release of information in carefully measured portions to guide trust, curiosity, and emotional investment. Instead of revealing everything at once, it creates a slow unfolding that keeps attention focused and anticipation alive. Humans are deeply responsive to partial access. What is revealed feels meaningful, and what is withheld feels important. The mind interprets selective sharing as intimacy. When someone discloses just enough, it signals vulnerability without full exposure. That balance feels safe yet compelling. The listener senses they are being let in, chosen, trusted. This perception deepens emotional engagement and lowers skepticism, even though the flow of information is tightly managed. Emotionally, controlled disclosure creates momentum. Each revelation invites the listener to stay present for the next one. Curiosity replaces caution. The brain fills in gaps with assumptions, often favorable ones, strengthening the emotional bond without additional effort from the source. This technique works because the mind dislikes uncertainty but is drawn to mystery. By resolving some questions while introducing new ones, controlled disclosure keeps emotional tension at an optimal level. Too much clarity would end interest. Too much secrecy would create distance. The balance keeps people leaning forward. Over time, the listener begins to associate the source with insight and depth. Information feels earned rather than given. Trust grows not because everything is known, but because the pacing feels intentional and meaningful. The influence lies not in what is shared, but in the timing, the restraint, and the emotional pull created by knowing there is always more just out of reach. Psychological momentum. Psychological momentum is the internal force that builds once a person starts moving in a particular mental or emotional direction. After an initial shift in thought, belief, or behavior, the mind prefers to continue forward rather than stop and reassess. Movement feels easier than interruption. Once momentum forms, questioning feels like friction. The brain is wired to conserve energy. Reevaluating decisions requires effort, while continuing along an established path feels smooth and natural. Psychological momentum takes advantage of this tendency by making progression feel inevitable. Each step forward reinforces the sense that the direction is already chosen. Emotionally, momentum creates commitment without conscious intention. The person begins to feel invested, even if they never explicitly decided to be. Stopping now feels uncomfortable, awkward, or unnecessary. The mind reframes continuation as logic and hesitation as disruption. This effect strengthens when actions are taken publicly or repeatedly. Each action becomes evidence that the path is correct. Doubt weakens not because it is resolved, but because it becomes inconvenient. The emotional weight of already started outweighs the discomfort of uncertainty. Psychological momentum is powerful because it replaces deliberate choice with flow. People stop asking whether they should continue and start assuming that they will. The direction feels self-sustaining, as if driven by circumstance rather than influence. Over time, momentum reshapes perception. Alternatives feel distant and irrelevant. The present course feels natural, even obvious. By the time awareness returns, the mind no longer asks why it moved forward, only how far it has already gone, mistaking motion for intention and progress for truth. Ambiguous intent. Ambiguous intent is the deliberate obscuring of true motives, allowing actions and words to remain open to interpretation. Instead of revealing a clear goal, it presents just enough meaning to invite curiosity while withholding certainty. The human mind is uncomfortable with unclear intention, and that discomfort keeps attention engaged. This technique works because people instinctively try to resolve uncertainty. When intent is ambiguous, the brain begins searching for patterns, explanations, and hidden meaning. That mental effort pulls focus inward, reducing the ability to question or challenge what is happening externally. The person becomes occupied with interpretation rather than evaluation. Emotionally, ambiguous intent creates tension mixed with intrigue. It keeps others guessing whether actions are benevolent, neutral, or strategic. That uncertainty can generate caution, hope, or anticipation, depending on the emotional cues surrounding it. Because nothing is explicit, emotions fill the gaps. Ambiguous intent also provides control through flexibility. Without a stated motive, actions cannot easily be confronted or opposed. If questioned, meanings can shift. What seemed calculated can be framed as accidental. What felt personal can be dismissed as general. This adaptability protects influence from accountability. Over time, repeated exposure to ambiguous intent trains people to adjust themselves instead. They become more careful, more attentive, and more reactive to subtle cues. The lack of clarity places the burden of interpretation on them, not the source. In that imbalance, power quietly settles, not through direction, but through uncertainty that never fully resolves. Emotional grounding. Emotional grounding is the act of stabilizing someone's emotional state by anchoring their attention to feelings of safety, presence, and control. When emotions run high, the mind becomes untethered, drifting into fear, anticipation, or overwhelm. Grounding pulls awareness back into the moment, slowing internal chaos and restoring a sense of balance. The brain seeks certainty during emotional turbulence. When grounding occurs, it reduces emotional noise and gives the nervous system something solid to hold on to. This creates relief. The person feels calmer, not because the situation changed, but because their internal state did. That calm becomes a point of trust. Emotionally, grounding creates dependence on the source providing stability. When someone consistently helps regulate emotional intensity, the mind begins to associate them with safety. In moments of distress, people instinctively look toward whoever helped them feel steady before. The presence alone becomes reassuring. This technique works because intense emotions narrow perception and increase vulnerability. When grounding lowers that intensity, defenses drop. The person feels clearer, more centered, and more open to guidance. Suggestions offered during this state feel supportive rather than intrusive because they arrive alongside relief. Over time, emotional grounding conditions behavior. People begin to rely on the same cues, voices, or interactions to regulate themselves. They may feel unsettled without them. What started as support quietly becomes influence, as emotional stability is outsourced rather than internalized. Emotional grounding doesn't overpower or rush. It slows, it soothes, and in that soothing, it reshapes emotional pathways. The mind learns where calm comes from, and once that association forms, it becomes easier to guide emotions, decisions, and responses simply by returning the person to that grounded state again. Pattern familiarity. Pattern familiarity is the psychological comfort that emerges when the mind repeatedly encounters the same structure, behavior, or sequence. The brain is wired to recognize patterns as a survival mechanism. What repeats without harm is quickly labeled safe. Once something feels safe, the mind stops scrutinizing it and begins to accept it automatically. This technique works because recognition reduces effort. When a pattern is familiar, the brain no longer needs to predict outcomes or prepare defenses. It knows what comes next, and that knowledge creates ease. Over time, the emotional response shifts from alertness to neutrality, then to comfort. Emotionally, familiar patterns create a sense of stability. They anchor the nervous system, making uncertainty feel distant. People begin to trust the pattern itself, even if they don't consciously trust the source. The repetition becomes reassuring, like a rhythm that lulls the mind into calm acceptance. Pattern familiarity is especially powerful because it disguises change. When new ideas are introduced within an existing pattern, they feel less threatening. The structure stays the same, so the content slips through unnoticed. The mind focuses on recognition, not evaluation. As exposure continues, familiarity becomes preference. People gravitate toward what they recognize, avoiding what feels unfamiliar or disruptive. Eventually, the pattern defines what feels normal. Influence deepens not through persuasion, but through repetition. The mind doesn't choose the pattern anymore. It settles into it, and within that comfort, resistance quietly disappears. Predictable cadence. Predictable cadence is the use of steady rhythm, timing, and structure to guide attention and emotional response. The human brain is highly responsive to patterns. When information arrives in a consistent flow, the mind relaxes. It no longer braces for surprise or disruption, and that relaxation opens the door to influence. Rhythm creates safety. Just as repetitive sounds can calm the nervous system, predictable verbal or emotional pacing lowers mental defenses. The listener begins to anticipate what comes next, and that anticipation reduces cognitive effort. When effort drops, critical awareness softens. Emotionally, predictable cadence creates comfort. The mind slips into a passive state where it listens without resistance. Familiar timing feels trustworthy, even when the content itself is new or questionable. The predictability becomes the focus, not the meaning. This technique works because attention follows ease. When delivery is smooth and expected, the brain stops interrupting with doubt. The listener feels guided rather than persuaded. Each phrase lands gently because it arrives exactly when the mind expects it to. Over time, predictable cadence conditions responsiveness. People begin to associate the rhythm with calm, clarity, or authority. The cadence itself becomes persuasive, independent of the message. Deviating from it would feel jarring, so the mind stays engaged to preserve the comfort. As influence deepens, the listener stops analyzing and starts absorbing. The steady flow carries emotion forward without friction. What feels like simple structure becomes control, not through force or urgency, but through repetition that trains the mind to relax, follow, and accept whatever arrives next in the same familiar rhythm. Trust signaling. Trust signaling is the act of conveying safety, reliability, and credibility without directly asking for trust. It works through subtle behaviors that reassure the nervous system before the conscious mind ever evaluates intention. Humans do not decide who to trust logically at first. They feel it. Trust signaling speaks to that feeling. The brain is constantly scanning for indicators of risk. Small cues like consistency, calm confidence, transparency in tone, and controlled vulnerability all signal that someone is safe to engage with. When these cues appear, the nervous system relaxes, suspicion fades, and openness increases without a clear reason why. Emotionally, trust signaling reduces vigilance. The mind stops bracing for deception and begins to assume alignment. This shift is powerful because skepticism requires energy, and once that energy is no longer needed, people default to acceptance. They listen more closely and question less. This technique is effective because it does not demand belief. It creates an environment where disbelief feels unnecessary. Trust becomes the emotional baseline rather than something that must be earned consciously. Once established, that baseline shapes how all future actions are interpreted. Over time, repeated trust signals create emotional familiarity. Familiarity feels safe, and safety feels true. Even inconsistencies are forgiven because the overall signal remains intact. The person feels guided by instinct rather than persuasion. Trust signaling doesn't convince the mind, it reassures the body. And once the body feels safe, the mind follows, believing the trust was its own decision all along. Minimal resistance framing. Minimal resistance framing is the technique of presenting ideas, requests, or changes in a way that feels easy to accept and emotionally non-threatening. Instead of confronting the mind with a decision that feels heavy or demanding, it gently guides attention toward what feels smooth, reasonable, and low effort. The brain is naturally drawn to paths that promise the least friction. The human mind is constantly balancing effort against comfort. When something feels complicated, risky, or emotionally costly, resistance rises automatically. Minimal resistance framing works by removing that sense of cost before the mind has a chance to object. The idea is introduced as small, natural, or already halfway agreed upon, making rejection feel unnecessary. Emotionally, this creates relief. The listener feels no pressure to defend themselves or protect their autonomy. There is no alarm, no urgency, no clear moment where they feel pushed. Instead, the option presented feels like the obvious next step, almost a continuation of what is already happening. This technique often relies on language that softens impact. Words like just, only, or for now shrink perceived commitment. The mind interprets the situation as temporary or flexible, lowering emotional barriers. Once accepted, the initial agreement becomes a new baseline. Over time, minimal resistance framing reshapes perception of choice. People begin to move forward without fully realizing when the decision was made. What felt optional becomes expected. What felt small becomes significant. The influence doesn't feel like persuasion because nothing was challenged. The mind wasn't convinced. It simply never felt the need to resist. Emotional reassurance. Emotional reassurance is the act of calming another person's internal fears, doubts, or anxieties in a way that makes them feel emotionally safe and supported. At its core, it addresses one of the strongest human needs, the need to feel secure in moments of uncertainty. When reassurance is present, the nervous system settles, and with that calm comes openness. The mind under emotional strain searches for stability. Doubt creates tension, and tension demands relief. Emotional reassurance provides that relief by signaling that everything is under control, that fears are understandable, and that there is no immediate danger. Once fear softens, resistance weakens. People become more willing to listen, trust, and follow. Emotionally, reassurance creates attachment. The person offering it becomes associated with safety and calm. In moments of stress, the mind remembers who made it feel steadier. That association can be powerful, especially when reassurance is given consistently during emotional lows. Comfort becomes a bond. This technique works because fear narrows perception. When fear fades, perspective widens. Reassurance gently shifts focus away from worst-case outcomes and towards stability. It doesn't remove uncertainty, but it dulls its emotional impact enough that questioning feels unnecessary. Over time, repeated emotional reassurance can create dependency. The mind begins to look outward for calm instead of generating it internally. The presence, voice, or approval of the reassuring source becomes a signal that everything is okay. In that dynamic, influence grows quietly. Decisions feel safer when guided by the one who consistently eases fear, and comfort begins to outweigh caution without the person realizing when that balance changed. Perceived inevitability. Perceived inevitability is the psychological state created when an outcome feels certain before a decision is consciously made. Instead of forcing agreement, it shapes expectations so thoroughly that resistance feels pointless. When the mind believes something is going to happen regardless, it stops evaluating whether it should happen at all. Humans are deeply influenced by what feels unavoidable. The brain is wired to conserve emotional and mental energy, and fighting what appears inevitable feels exhausting. When an outcome is framed as already unfolding, the nervous system shifts from decision-making into adaptation. Acceptance feels easier than struggle. Emotionally, perceived inevitability creates surrender. Not dramatic surrender, but quiet resignation. The person feels carried by momentum rather than pushed by pressure. Doubt fades, not because it was answered, but because it feels irrelevant. The emotional question shifts from "should I?" to "how do I adjust?" This technique works by narrowing perceived options. Alternatives still exist, but they feel unrealistic, impractical, or emotionally costly. The mind gravitates toward the path that appears aligned with reality. Agreement begins to feel like realism rather than compliance. Perceived inevitability is strengthened through tone, timing, and repetition. When something is spoken about calmly, confidently, and consistently, it begins to feel established. Over time, the mind internalizes the assumption and treats it as fact. As this belief settles in, people begin to align themselves proactively. They justify, prepare, and even defend the outcome, believing they arrived there independently. The most powerful part of perceived inevitability is that it removes the sense of choice without ever removing the illusion of agency, allowing acceptance to feel natural, rational, and emotionally effortless. Cognitive anchoring. Cognitive anchoring is the process of fixing the mind to an initial idea, reference point, or assumption that quietly shapes all thinking that follows. Once an anchor is set, the brain uses it as a mental starting position, measuring everything else against it, rather than evaluating information independently. The anchor becomes invisible, yet it holds tremendous influence. The mind relies on anchors because they reduce uncertainty. Faced with complexity, the brain seeks something solid to stand on. That first piece of information offers stability. Even when new data appears, the mind rarely discards the anchor. Instead, It adjusts slightly around it, staying emotionally loyal to the original reference point. Emotionally, anchors feel grounding. They provide a sense of orientation in an otherwise uncertain mental space. Letting go of an anchor creates discomfort because it requires admitting that the initial understanding may have been incomplete or wrong. The brain resists that discomfort by defending the anchor, often without conscious awareness. Cognitive anchoring is especially powerful when the anchor is introduced confidently or carries emotional weight. Numbers, labels, expectations, or first impressions delivered with certainty embed deeply. Once anchored, alternatives feel extreme, unrealistic, or unsafe simply because they deviate too far from the original frame. Over time, the anchor shapes belief, judgment, and memory. People recall information in ways that support it. They overlook contradictions and emphasize confirmations. The anchor quietly becomes truth, not because it was accurate, but because it was first. Influence persists not through pressure, but through the mind's reluctance to abandon what once made sense, even when it no longer fully does. Subtle persuasion. Subtle persuasion is the art of influencing thoughts, feelings, and decisions without triggering awareness or resistance. Instead of pushing ideas directly, it works by gently shaping perception until agreement feels natural. The person doesn't feel persuaded, they feel aligned. The influence is quiet, smooth, and emotionally disarming. The human mind instinctively resists overt attempts at control. When persuasion is obvious, defenses rise. Subtle persuasion bypasses those defenses by avoiding confrontation altogether. It blends into conversation, tone, and timing, allowing ideas to feel like shared understanding rather than external pressure. Emotionally, subtle persuasion creates comfort. There is no urgency, no force, no demand to decide. That emotional ease lowers vigilance. When people feel relaxed and respected, they stop scanning for manipulation. In that openness, suggestions settle more deeply. This technique often works by guiding attention rather than directing action. Certain ideas are highlighted, others are left unspoken. The mind fills in gaps on its own, and self-generated conclusions feel more trustworthy than imposed ones. What feels like personal insight carries emotional weight. Subtle persuasion also relies on patience. Influence builds gradually through consistency and familiarity. Each interaction reinforces a direction without ever stating it outright. Over time, preferences shift, beliefs soften, and choices begin to align with the influence that has been quietly present all along. Because there is no clear moment of persuasion, there is no clear moment to resist. The individual believes they chose freely. The emotion attached to that belief strengthens commitment. Subtle persuasion doesn't demand agreement. It allows the mind to arrive there gently, convinced it was always heading that way on its own. Comfort, authority. Comfort authority is the influence gained when someone becomes a consistent source of emotional ease, safety, and calm. Unlike traditional authority, which relies on power, status, or fear, comfort authority is rooted in relief. The mind naturally gravitates toward whoever reduces stress and makes uncertainty feel manageable. Over time, that relief becomes credibility. This works because the nervous system remembers comfort more strongly than information. When someone repeatedly soothes anxiety, steadies emotions, or simplifies chaos, the brain begins to associate them with safety. Their presence alone can lower tension. Once that association forms, their words carry more weight, not because they are proven correct, but because they feel stabilizing. Emotionally, comfort authority creates trust without scrutiny. The mind assumes that whoever brings calm must understand what's happening. In moments of doubt or overwhelm, people stop questioning and start deferring. Guidance from a comforting source feels protective, even when it subtly directs behavior or belief. This technique is powerful because it bypasses resistance. Fear creates boundaries, but comfort dissolves them. When people feel emotionally held, they become more open, more compliant, and more willing to accept direction. The authority feels earned through care rather than imposed through force. Over time, reliance deepens. The individual begins to seek reassurance before making decisions, trusting the calming presence more than their own judgment. Comfort becomes a signal of correctness. In that dynamic, influence no longer needs justification. It flows naturally from the person who consistently makes everything feel okay, even when clarity is quietly being replaced by dependence. Emotional normalization. Emotional normalization is the act of making a feeling seem expected, reasonable, and widely shared, reducing the impulse to question or resist it. When an emotion is framed as normal, the mind stops treating it as a signal that something is wrong. Instead, it becomes something to settle into rather than examine. Humans constantly look to their environment to judge whether their internal reactions are appropriate. When a feeling is subtly presented as common or understandable, it lowers self-doubt and dissolves inner conflict. The emotion no longer feels like a warning, it feels like confirmation. This shift is powerful because it quiets the part of the mind that might otherwise push back. Emotionally, normalization creates relief. People feel less alone in what they are experiencing. That relief is soothing, and the nervous system responds by relaxing its defenses. Once an emotion feels accepted, it gains stability. It lingers longer, feels safer, and becomes easier to act from. This technique works by reframing intensity as familiarity. Fear becomes caution, doubt becomes realism, discomfort becomes growth. By renaming and contextualizing emotions, the emotional weight changes without the emotion itself disappearing. The person feels grounded rather than alarmed. Over time, emotional normalization shapes behavior by removing urgency. When emotions feel ordinary, they stop triggering reflection. People move forward while carrying them, rather than stopping to question why they're there. The influence is subtle but lasting. What began as a reaction becomes a baseline, and once an emotion feels like the norm, it quietly guides decisions, perceptions, and identity without ever demanding attention. Reassuring repetition. Reassuring repetition is the act of repeating the same calming message, idea, or emotional signal until the mind stops questioning it. The human brain is wired to associate repetition with truth and safety. When something is heard again and again, especially in a steady, confident tone, it begins to feel familiar. Familiarity lowers alertness, and lowered alertness opens the door to acceptance. This technique works because uncertainty creates tension. The mind searches for stability, and repetition provides it. Each repeated phrase subtly reinforces the idea that nothing has changed, nothing is wrong, and there is no need to reassess. Over time, the message stops feeling like information and starts feeling like an emotional constant. Emotionally, reassuring repetition soothes anxiety by creating predictability. Predictability tells the nervous system it can relax. Even if the words themselves are simple, their consistency creates a rhythm the brain learns to trust. The repetition becomes a mental anchor, something steady to hold on to when doubt tries to surface. As the message repeats, resistance weakens. The mind grows tired of questioning what keeps arriving unchanged. Instead of analyzing, it absorbs. What was once evaluated becomes assumed. The reassurance no longer feels external. It feels internal, as if the person reached the conclusion on their own. This technique is powerful because it doesn't demand belief. It waits for belief to form naturally through exposure. Each repetition gently nudges the emotional state toward calm acceptance. Over time, the message feels less like persuasion and more like background truth, quietly shaping perception and behavior while the mind rests in the comfort of hearing what it has already learned to expect. Gentle certainty. Gentle certainty is the expression of confidence without force, urgency, or aggression. It communicates assurance so calmly that it feels stabilizing rather than controlling. The mind is naturally drawn to certainty because uncertainty creates emotional strain. When certainty is delivered gently, it offers relief without triggering resistance. This technique works because the brain equates calm confidence with safety. Loud certainty feels threatening and invites opposition, but quiet certainty feels grounded and trustworthy. There is no pressure to agree, yet disagreement feels unnecessary. The message doesn't argue for itself, it simply exists, steady and unshaken. Emotionally, gentle certainty soothes anxiety. When someone speaks or acts with composed assurance, it signals that things are under control. The nervous system responds by relaxing. In that relaxed state, people stop questioning and start accepting. The absence of doubt feels reassuring, especially when emotions are already unsettled. Gentle certainty also reshapes perception of authority. It doesn't demand recognition, it assumes it. That assumption subtly invites alignment. The mind reads the calmness as experience, as knowing, as having already considered alternatives. Doubt begins to feel redundant. Over time, repeated exposure to gentle certainty conditions trust. People begin to rely on the steadiness of the tone rather than the content of the message. The confidence becomes the proof. Suggestions offered within this state feel safe to follow because they are wrapped in emotional stability. The power of gentle certainty lies in how little it asks. It doesn't need to convince. It doesn't need to explain. It simply remains consistent, calm, and sure, allowing others to step into that certainty as a way to quiet their own uncertainty, mistaking emotional relief for truth and calm for correctness. Familiar language bias. Familiar language bias is the tendency of the mind to trust, accept, and feel comforted by words and phrases it recognizes. Language that feels known reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the brain's greatest stressors. When something is expressed in familiar terms, the mind relaxes, assuming understanding even before true comprehension occurs. This works because the brain equates familiarity with safety. Words that sound common, conversational, or culturally familiar bypass analytical scrutiny. They feel approachable, non-threatening, and trustworthy. Complex or unfamiliar language, by contrast, triggers alertness and caution. Familiar language lowers that guard quietly. Emotionally, this bias creates a sense of belonging. People feel included rather than challenged. When language mirrors what someone already uses or hears regularly, it feels personal and validating. The message feels like it comes from someone like me, which strengthens emotional alignment and trust. The mind often mistakes ease of processing for truth. When words are easy to understand, the message feels more accurate, more reasonable, and more honest. The emotional comfort of recognition replaces the need for verification. Agreement happens faster because nothing feels mentally demanding. Over time, familiar language bias shapes belief systems. Repeated exposure to ideas phrased in comfortable, recognizable ways makes those ideas feel normal and correct. Alternatives expressed in unfamiliar language begin to feel wrong or suspicious, even if they are more accurate. Influence grows not through persuasion, but through linguistic comfort. The mind doesn't ask whether the message is true, it asks whether it feels familiar, and familiarity quietly decides the rest. Implied understanding. Implied understanding is the subtle suggestion that you already comprehend someone's thoughts, feelings, or motives without requiring them to fully explain themselves. Instead of asking for clarity, it quietly assumes depth. This creates an immediate sense of connection, as if the inner experience has already been recognized and accepted. The human mind longs to be understood without effort. Explaining oneself requires vulnerability, energy, and risk. When understanding is implied, that burden disappears. The person feels seen without exposure, known without confession. This emotional relief lowers defenses and builds trust faster than direct questioning ever could. Emotionally, implied understanding feels intimate. It creates the sensation of shared perspective, even if little has been exchanged. The listener fills in the gaps themselves, projecting their inner world onto the assumption of being understood. That projection strengthens the bond, because the meaning comes from them, not you. This technique works because people are more influenced by conclusions they arrive at internally. When someone believes you understand them, they instinctively move closer, emotionally and psychologically. They become more open, more agreeable, and more willing to align because disagreement would disrupt the feeling of connection. Implied understanding also discourages correction. If someone challenges the assumption, they risk breaking the sense of harmony. Silence becomes confirmation. The lack of objection reinforces the illusion of alignment. Over time, this creates quiet authority. The person begins to trust your interpretations of them, sometimes more than their own. They feel guided rather than interpreted. The understanding feels mutual, even if it was never verified. In that unspoken space, influence deepens, built not on explicit agreement, but on the powerful comfort of believing someone already knows. Psychological safety cues. Psychological safety cues are subtle signals that tell the mind it is safe to relax, speak, listen, or comply without fear of harm or judgment. These cues operate beneath conscious awareness, shaping emotional comfort before logic ever engages. When the brain senses safety, defenses lower automatically, and openness replaces vigilance. Humans are wired to constantly assess their environment for threat. Small details like tone, posture, pacing, facial expression, and word choice all contribute to this assessment. Psychological safety cues quietly answer the brain's most important question: am I safe here? When the answer feels like yes, resistance dissolves without effort. Emotionally, safety creates permission to feel, to trust, to stay present. Once that permission is granted, the nervous system shifts out of survival mode. Curiosity replaces caution. Receptivity replaces skepticism. The person stops protecting themselves and starts engaging. This technique is powerful because it doesn't push influence directly. Instead, it removes the barriers that normally block it. When people feel emotionally safe, they are more likely to accept ideas, follow guidance, and align with whoever provides that safety. The influence feels voluntary, even comforting. Psychological safety cues often come in the form of calm consistency and non-threatening confidence. Nothing feels rushed. Nothing feels unpredictable. Over time, the brain associates the source of these cues with relief. Trust forms not from evidence, but from emotional regulation. As exposure continues, people begin to seek out the presence that provides safety. They relax faster, question less, and open more readily. The cues become invisible, but their effect deepens. Influence grows strongest, not where fear is applied, but where the mind feels safe enough to stop resisting entirely. Calm assertion. Calm assertion is the act of stating a position clearly and confidently without emotional intensity, defensiveness, or force. It does not ask for permission, and it does not seek validation. It simply states what is, allowing certainty to exist without tension. This calmness makes the assertion feel grounded rather than aggressive. The human mind is highly reactive to emotional charge. When statements are delivered with urgency or pressure, the brain prepares to defend itself. Calm assertion avoids this reaction entirely. Because there is no visible struggle for control, the mind doesn't feel challenged. It listens instead of resisting. Emotionally, calm assertion creates stability. The lack of emotional volatility signals confidence and self-control. People tend to trust those who appear unshaken, especially in moments of uncertainty. The nervous system reads calm assertion as competence, as someone who does not need to prove themselves. This technique is powerful because it removes the push and pull dynamic from influence. There is no debate to win and no reaction to provoke. The statement stands on its own. Silence after the assertion often carries more weight than explanation, allowing the message to settle without interference. Calm assertion also shifts responsibility inward. Because nothing is forced, the listener feels free to choose, yet subtly guided by the steadiness presented. The certainty feels earned, not imposed. Over time, repeated calm assertion establishes authority without dominance. People begin to anticipate consistency and reliability. The voice becomes a reference point. When decisions arise, that calm certainty echoes in the background, shaping choices quietly. Calm assertion doesn't convince through logic or pressure. It convinces through emotional composure. In a world filled with urgency and noise, calm becomes persuasive simply by being rare, and certainty becomes influential simply by remaining steady. Passive influence. Passive influence is the ability to shape thoughts, emotions, and behavior without direct persuasion or visible effort. It works in the background, embedded in presence, tone, environment, and consistency rather than arguments or commands. Nothing is demanded, nothing is pushed, and that is precisely why it works. The human mind is constantly absorbing signals it doesn't consciously register. Silence, timing, proximity, and emotional steadiness all communicate meaning. Passive influence operates through these signals, allowing people to arrive at conclusions they believe are entirely their own. Because there is no obvious attempt to persuade, defenses stay down. Emotionally, passive influence feels safe. There is no pressure to respond, no urgency to decide, no threat to autonomy. This lack of force creates openness. People are more receptive when they don't feel targeted. The influence settles gently, like background music shaping mood without drawing attention to itself. This technique thrives on consistency, a calm demeanor, predictable reactions, or steady values slowly become reference points. Others begin adjusting themselves around that presence, unconsciously syncing their behavior and expectations to it. The influence comes not from what is said, but from what is repeatedly modeled. Over time, passive influence reshapes norms. What once felt optional begins to feel natural. What once felt questionable begins to feel acceptable. Because nothing dramatic marks the shift, awareness lags behind change. The mind adapts quietly, mistaking exposure for choice. Passive influence is powerful because it never asks for permission. It doesn't need agreement. It simply exists long enough to be absorbed, and once absorbed, it feels less like influence and more like reality itself. Emotional alignment. Emotional alignment is the process of bringing another person's emotional state into harmony with your own, so that it feels shared, synchronized, and mutually reinforcing. Rather than reacting separately, both emotional experiences begin to move together. When alignment occurs, disagreement softens because emotional separation disappears. The human nervous system is constantly attuned to emotional coherence. When emotions feel aligned, the brain interprets the interaction as safe and connected. This safety reduces vigilance. The mind no longer feels the need to protect itself, making influence feel less like persuasion and more like mutual understanding. Emotionally, alignment creates unity. The person begins to feel that you are on the same side, even if no explicit agreement has been made. This shared emotional ground becomes more important than the specifics of the conversation. Once alignment is established, logical differences feel secondary, even irrelevant. This technique works because emotions guide interpretation. When feelings are aligned, messages are filtered through trust rather than skepticism. The listener hears intention instead of threat, support instead of pressure. Emotional alignment reframes influence as cooperation. Over time, aligned emotions begin to guide behavior. The individual adjusts responses to maintain harmony, often unconsciously. Acting against alignment feels disruptive, like breaking an unspoken bond. Agreement feels smoother than resistance. Emotional alignment is powerful because it removes the sense of opposition. There is no you versus me, only shared movement. The person feels carried alongside rather than led from behind. As alignment deepens, influence becomes effortless. The direction feels mutual, the emotion feels shared, and decisions feel natural, even though the alignment itself quietly shaped what felt right long before a choice was ever named. Gradual quieting. Gradual quieting is the slow reduction of mental and emotional stimulation until the mind naturally settles into stillness. Instead of forcing calm, it gently removes intensity piece by piece, allowing the nervous system to descend without resistance. The shift is so smooth that the mind doesn't register it as change, only as relief. The brain resists sudden silence. Abrupt calm can feel unsafe, like a loss of awareness. Gradual quieting avoids this by easing tension incrementally. Thoughts slow, emotions soften, and attention narrows without triggering alarm. Each moment feels only slightly quieter than the last, making stillness feel earned rather than imposed. Emotionally, this technique creates surrender. The mind stops bracing because nothing demands reaction anymore. There is no sharp contrast to push against, no clear signal that control is being taken away. Instead, the internal noise simply fades, and with it, the urge to analyze or resist. Gradual quieting works because the nervous system mirrors its environment. When stimulation decreases steadily, the body follows. Breathing slows, muscles loosen, mental chatter thins out. The absence of urgency begins to feel safe, even comforting. Over time, the mind adapts to the lowered intensity as its new normal. What once felt empty now feels peaceful. The person may not notice when alertness gives way to passivity, only that effort feels unnecessary. Influence becomes easier in this state because quiet minds question less. In the softened space created by gradual quieting, thoughts drift, awareness loosens, and the need to stay actively in control gently dissolves without ever being challenged. Suggestive pacing. Suggestive pacing is the subtle guiding of thought and emotion by controlling rhythm, timing, and sequence rather than content. It works not by what is said, but by how and when it is delivered. The mind is highly responsive to pace, and when that pace feels natural, it follows without resistance. The brain processes information in patterns. When ideas arrive too quickly, the mind feels overwhelmed. When they arrive too slowly, attention drifts. Suggestive pacing finds the rhythm that keeps the listener engaged but relaxed. In that state, awareness softens, and thoughts begin to flow in the direction set by the pacing itself. Emotionally, pacing creates safety. A steady, predictable rhythm calms the nervous system. As tension drops, the listener becomes more receptive. Each pause feels intentional. Each progression feels earned. The mind stops anticipating and starts absorbing, trusting the flow rather than questioning it. This technique often begins by matching the listener's current pace. If emotions are fast and scattered, the pacing meets that energy first. Once alignment is established, the pace gradually slows or shifts, gently pulling the emotional state along with it. The change feels internal, not guided. Suggestive pacing is powerful because it disguises influence as process. The listener feels carried rather than led. Ideas introduced at the right moment feel obvious, even inevitable. The timing makes them land with emotional weight. Over time, the mind associates the pacing with clarity and comfort. It learns to follow the rhythm automatically. Suggestions delivered within that rhythm feel natural and unforced. The influence doesn't arrive as a directive, but as the next step in a sequence. The mind is already moving through, mistaking guided progression for its own momentum. Mental settling. Mental settling is the psychological process where the mind gradually relaxes into a state of lowered alertness and reduced resistance. It occurs when stimulation slows, uncertainty fades, and the brain decides that nothing urgent needs to be solved. In this state, thoughts lose their sharp edges, and the need to question or challenge quietly dissolves. The human mind is constantly scanning for threats, changes, and decisions that require action. When those signals decrease, the nervous system shifts from vigilance to rest. Mental settling feels like exhaling internally. The pressure to analyze weakens, and attention drifts from active evaluation to passive awareness. Emotionally, this state brings relief. Tension softens, urgency disappears, and effort feels unnecessary. The mind becomes more receptive because resistance requires energy and settling conserves it. Ideas introduced during this phase are not weighed heavily. They are absorbed gently, often without being noticed. Mental settling is powerful because it feels natural and self-directed. People believe they are simply calming down, unaware that this calm also lowers cognitive defenses. The mind prioritizes comfort over scrutiny. It prefers continuity over disruption. In that preference, influence finds space to enter. As settling deepens, boundaries blur. Distinctions that once mattered feel less important. The desire to correct, object, or interrupt fades. The mind wants stillness, not conflict. It allows thoughts to pass through without gripping them too tightly. Over time, repeated experiences of mental settling condition the brain to associate certain environments, voices, or rhythms with calm acceptance. Once that association forms, entering that state becomes easier and faster. The mind settles almost on cue, and in that quiet openness, ideas no longer need to convince. They only need to arrive while the mind is already at rest. Reduced vigilance. Reduced vigilance is the psychological state in which awareness, skepticism, and self-protection quietly lower without the person realizing it. It doesn't come from force or exhaustion alone, but from comfort. When the mind feels safe, familiar, or emotionally settled, it stops scanning for threat. Attention softens. Guardrails drop. The human brain is constantly monitoring its environment for danger, inconsistency, or manipulation. That vigilance requires energy. When surroundings feel predictable and emotionally calm, the brain conserves resources by relaxing its alert systems. This is when influence slips in most easily, not because the person is weak, but because they feel secure. Emotionally, reduced vigilance feels like ease. Conversations flow, doubt quiets, the need to question fades. The individual feels present rather than cautious, engaged rather than defensive. In this state, trust doesn't feel like a risk, it feels like the default. This effect is amplified by warmth, familiarity, and repetition. When nothing feels urgent or threatening, the mind assumes there is nothing to protect against. Subtle cues are missed. Intent is no longer examined closely. The emotional system prioritizes comfort over evaluation. Reduced vigilance is powerful because it disguises itself as peace. The person believes they are thinking clearly, when in reality, they are thinking less critically. Boundaries loosen not because they were challenged, but because they seemed unnecessary. Over time, lowered vigilance becomes habitual. The mind learns that this environment doesn't require armor. In that openness, suggestions feel harmless, guidance feels supportive, and influence feels natural. The most effective control doesn't trigger alarms. It arrives only after the alarms have gone quiet, when attention is relaxed and trust feels effortless. Soothing authority. Soothing authority is the combination of calm emotional presence with quiet confidence, creating influence that feels protective rather than forceful. It is authority that does not demand attention, yet naturally receives it. The mind relaxes in its presence because it senses guidance without threat. Humans are drawn to figures who appear both composed and certain. When authority is expressed through steadiness instead of intensity, the nervous system interprets it as safety. There is no need to fight, flee, or question. The calm signals that someone else is holding control, and that control feels reassuring. Emotionally, soothing authority reduces the burden of decision-making. People feel relief when they believe someone else has already assessed the situation and knows what to do. That relief creates trust. Trust opens the door to compliance, not because it is demanded, but because it feels easier than resisting. This technique works through tone, pacing, and restraint. A slow voice, measured words, and an absence of urgency communicate confidence. Nothing feels rushed. Nothing feels unstable. The authority feels grounded, and grounding feels safe to the brain. Over time, repeated exposure conditions people to associate that calm presence with certainty and protection. They stop seeking alternatives because the emotional need for reassurance is already being met. Questions fade before they fully form. Soothing authority is powerful because it never competes. It does not argue or assert dominance openly. It simply remains steady while others fluctuate. In that contrast, people align naturally. Influence flows from the comfort of being guided rather than the pressure of being pushed, and control is accepted not as submission, but as emotional relief that feels almost like care.